Hello and welcome. Do you want to successfully complete the D564 OA exam? Then you are in the right place. Our website has free questions and answers for the D564 OA exam. We know OA exams are tough, so our guides and practice questions are all free. With over 100 plus success stories, we have proven our videos will help you pass your exam on the first attempt. In this video, we will cover questions from psychoanalytic theory, analytical psychology, individual psychology, psychosocial development, neo-Freudian perspectives. So, let's get started.
Question 1. A graduate student skips meals and ignores fatigue while frantically chasing immediate pleasure during finals week, raiding the snack drawer and binge-watching shows whenever the urge hits. A friend points out that the student is acting purely on impulse with no thought to consequences. According to Freud's structural model of personality, which component is dominating the student's behavior? Your options are A. The superego, because it enforces moral standards. B. The ego, because it mediates between drives and reality. C. The id, because it operates on the pleasure principle. D. The pre-conscious, because it stores accessible memories. Which one is it? Pause the video if you need more time. The correct answer is C. The ID, because it operates on the pleasure principle. C is correct because the ID operates entirely on the pleasure principle, demanding immediate gratification of biological drives without regard to logic, morality, or consequences. Freud described it as the primitive reservoir of psychic energy that pushes the person toward whatever feels good in the moment. A is wrong because the superego is the moral conscience that produces guilt and restraint, the opposite of impulsive indulgence. A student dominated by the superego would feel guilty about skipping meals and study time, not driven to chase every urge. B is wrong because the ego works on the reality principle, postponing gratification and weighing consequences, which is exactly what the scenario shows as missing. An ego-dominated student would balance immediate wants against the upcoming exam. D is wrong because the pre-conscious is a level of awareness in Freud's topographic model, not a structural component that drives behavior. It holds material that can be brought to consciousness with effort, but it does not generate impulses. At the foundation of Freud's structural model sits the ide, the most primitive part of personality, present from birth and entirely unconscious. Understanding it means understanding why people sometimes act completely against their own interests. The id is powered by raw biological drives, hunger, aggression, sexual desire, and operates entirely on the pleasure principle. Discharge tension immediately, no matter the consequences. It never reaches consciousness and has no concept of time or logic. Freud proposed the id because conscious decision-making alone couldn't explain impulsive, self-defeating behavior. Personality is a system of competing forces. The id wants, the ego negotiates, and the superego judges. Conflict between these structures drives much of human behavior. The clearest way to keep these straight is by function. If a scenario shows someone acting on pure impulse with zero regard for rules or outcomes, that's the id. Decision-making points to the ego. Guilt and moral self-criticism point to the superego. Watch for signal words like impulse, pleasure principle, tension reduction, and immediate gratification. When someone acts purely on biological urge with no planning or remorse, the id is in plain view. Question 2. A man whose father recently died refuses to discuss the loss, insists his father is simply away on a long trip, and keeps the man's bedroom untouched as if he might return any day. A therapist recognizes a defense mechanism at work. Which mechanism best fits this pattern? Your options are A. Denial, because the man refuses to accept the reality of the loss. B. Projection, because the man assigns his feelings to others. C. Displacement, because the man redirects emotion onto a substitute. D. Sublimation, because the mind channels grief into productive work. Take a second. Which answer would you pick? The correct answer is A. Denial, because the man refuses to accept the reality of the loss. A is correct because denial is the defense mechanism in which the ego refuses to acknowledge a painful external reality. The mind's insistence that his father is merely traveling is a textbook refusal to accept what has happened, protecting him from the full weight of the grief. B is wrong because projection involves attributing one's own unacceptable feelings to another person, such as accusing a co-worker of being angry when the anger is really one's own. The scenario shows no such transfer of feeling onto another person. C is wrong because displacement redirects an emotion from its original target to a safer one, like yelling at a family member after a bad day at work. The man is not redirecting his grief, he is refusing to acknowledge it at all. D is wrong because sublimation channels unacceptable impulses into socially valued activities, such as turning aggression into competitive sport. The man is not transforming his grief into anything productive, he is simply blocking it out. Denial is one of the ego's most fundamental defense mechanisms, a complete refusal to accept an external reality that feels too overwhelming to face. Unlike repression, which targets internal impulses, denial closes the door on something that has already happened in the outside world. The ego sits between the ID's raw demands, the superego's moral prohibitions, and the hard facts of external reality. When these pressures overwhelm its resources, the ego deploys unconscious defense mechanisms, automatic strategies that keep anxiety manageable, even at the cost of distorting what is real. It helps to see how denial differs from its closest neighbors. Repression targets an internal wish or memory, not an outside event. Rationalization engages with reality by reframing it. Reaction formation flips an impulse into its opposite. Denial alone refuses to let the external fact enter awareness at all. Picture a man whose father has just died. He keeps setting a place at the table, leaves the bedroom untouched, and tells friends his father is away on a trip. There is no reframing, no redirection, only a closed door against the fact of the loss. The exam clue for denial is always the person's relationship to an undeniable external fact. Thus, they refuse to acknowledge it happened at all. Watch for bereavement, illness, and addiction scenarios where the person continues life as before despite clear evidence, and denial becomes the most likely answer. Question 3. A 6-year-old boy becomes intensely attached to his mother, frequently announces he wants to marry her, and treats his father with sudden coolness and competitiveness. A textbook on Freudian theory would place this pattern in a specific psychosocial stage. Which stage best matches the behavior? Your options are A. The oral stage, where pleasure centers on feeding and dependency. B. The anal stage, where conflict centers on control and autonomy. C. The latency stage, where sexual energy is largely dormant. D. The phallic stage, where the Oedipus complex emerges. Before I reveal it, which one do you think is right? The correct answer is D. The phallic stage, where the Oedipus complex emerges. D is correct because Freud placed the Oedipus complex squarely in the phallic stage, roughly ages 3 to 6, when the child develops unconscious romantic attachment to the opposite sex parent and rivalry with the same sex parent. The boy's behavior is the classic illustration Freud used to describe this stage. A is wrong because the oral stage covers the first year of life and centers on feeding, sucking, and weaning. A 6-year-old has long passed this stage, and the behaviors described have nothing to do with oral gratification. B is wrong because the anal stage focuses on toilet training and the conflict between holding on and letting go, occurring roughly ages 1 to 3. The scenario does not involve issues of control, retention, or expulsion. C is wrong because the latency stage spans roughly age 6 through puberty and is described as a quiet period when sexual energy is sublimated into school and friendships. The intense attachment and rivalry described mark the end of the phallic stage rather than latency. The phallic stage is Freud's third psychosexual stage, running from about age 3 to 6. This is the period when the Oedipus complex takes center stage, and when the foundations of the superego begin to form. Freud arranged development into 5 stages, each defined by a different source of conflict and pleasure. The phallic stage sits between the anal stage and the quiet latency period, and it is the only stage where the Oedipus complex is the central drama. In boys, the Oedipus complex follows a 3-step arc: unconscious attachment to the mother, rivalry with and fear of the father, called castration anxiety, and finally resolution through identification with the father. That identification absorbs the father's values, forming the core of the superego. Freud described a parallel process in girls called the Electra complex. When a scenario describes a preschool-aged child with intense closeness to the opposite sex parent and competitive feelings toward the same-sex parent, the phallic stage is the answer. The combination of age, attachment, and rivalry is what makes it unambiguous, not just any intense parent-child dynamic. Remember, the Oedipus complex is age-specific. A jealous teenager or a clinging toddler is not showing Oedipal dynamics. Look for the full combination: preschool age, romantic feeling toward one parent, and rivalry with the other. Question 4. A nurse caring for a frightened pediatric patient feels a strong urge to snap at the difficult parents, but instead speaks calmly, follows hospital policy, and asks the charge nurse for a brief break. A psychology instructor describes this as the part of the personality that adapts impulse to circumstance. Which Freudian structure is doing this work? Your options are A. The id, because it discharges tension immediately. B. The ego, because it operates on the reality principle. C. The superego, because it enforces idealized moral standards. D. The collective unconscious, because it shapes universal responses. What's your answer? Commit to one before I continue. The correct answer is B. The ego, because it operates on the reality principle. B is correct because the ego operates on the reality principle, balancing the demands of the id, the constraints of the superego, and the limitations of the external world. The nurse channels the impulse to snap into a measured, professionally appropriate response, which is exactly the ego's role. A is wrong because the id would push the nurse to snap at the parents on impulse, with no concern for consequences or appropriateness. The behavior described shows control over impulse rather than expression of it. C is wrong because the superego would generate guilt or insist on perfect, saintly conduct, but it does not negotiate with reality. The nurse's choice to take a break is a practical compromise, not a moral demand. D is wrong because the collective unconscious is Jung's concept, not Freud's, and refers to inherited universal symbols rather than an internal mediator of impulse and rule. The ego is the executive of Freud's structural model, the part of the personality that negotiates between competing forces. Understanding how it works requires separating 2 different maps Freud drew of the same psyche. The id pushes for immediate gratification. The superego enforces moral standards, and the outside world imposes its own constraints. The ego stands in the middle and works out a livable arrangement among all 3, where the id runs on the pleasure principle, demanding immediate release of tension. The ego runs on the reality principle. It postpones gratification, weighs consequences, and uses logical, time-aware secondary process thinking to find responses that actually fit the circumstances. The most common mistake is treating the ego as simply the conscious, intentional self. The Freudian ego is broader. It includes automatic unconscious work like defense mechanisms. It is also not the source of moral standards. That belongs to the superego. When you see a description of someone managing an impulse against external constraints in a workable, situation-appropriate way, that is the ego at work, steering between raw impulse and rigid moral judgment, using reality as its guide. Question 5. An adult who experienced no obvious trauma reports persistent self-defeating habits, slips of the tongue that reveal hostility she does not feel consciously, and dreams that puzzle her. A Freudian clinician would say her behavior is governed by forces outside conscious awareness. This view rests on which assumption? Your options are: A. Behavior is fundamentally random and unpredictable. B. Behavior is shaped only by reinforcement schedules. C. Behavior is determined by unconscious psychological forces. D. Behavior is a direct reflection of conscious choice. Pick one. Trust your gut. Here's your chance to test yourself. The correct answer is C. Behavior is determined by unconscious psychological forces. C is correct because Freud's principle of psychic determinism holds that nothing in mental life is accidental and that even slips, dreams, and symptoms are caused by unconscious forces. The clinician's interpretation rests directly on this assumption. A is wrong because Freud explicitly rejected the idea that behavior is random. The whole project of psychoanalysis is to uncover the hidden causes of behavior that appear random on the surface. B is wrong because reinforcement schedules belong to operant behaviorism, associated with Skinner, not Freud. Psychoanalytic theory predates that framework and looks inward to unconscious conflict, rather than outward to environmental rewards. D is wrong because a core Freudian claim is that consciousness is only a small portion of mental life. The clinician would not assume the patient's behavior reflects pure conscious choice when the symptoms point clearly to hidden forces. Psychic determinism is Freud's foundational claim that nothing in mental life is an accident. Every dream, every slip of the tongue, every symptom has a cause, and that cause is almost always hidden in the unconscious. Unconscious forces reveal themselves in disguised forms. A verbal slip briefly bypasses the mind's sensor. A dream stages hidden wishes symbolically. And a neurotic symptom is the ego's uneasy compromise with an unacceptable impulse. The mechanism is the dynamic unconscious. Repression pushes threatening material out of awareness, but that material doesn't disappear. It retains its energy and keeps shaping behavior from below the surface. Don't confuse psychic determinism with other frameworks. Bandura's reciprocal determinism is a three-way loop between person, behavior, and environment. The operant view traces behavior to external consequences. Only Freud's version insists the causes are unconscious and rooted in suppressed inner conflict. The core commitment is this: even trivial, apparently random acts, forgetting a name, losing a wallet, point to hidden mental forces. Whenever you see behavior explained by unconscious, hidden causes tied to early experience, psychic determinism is the assumption being invoked. Question 6. A literature professor analyzing world myths notices that hero figures from unrelated cultures share remarkably similar features, such as a humble origin, a journey, a great trial, and a return with wisdom. A Jungian colleague explains the pattern in terms of a deeper layer of the psyche shared across humanity. Which concept best names that layer? Your options are: A. The collective unconscious because it holds inherited universal patterns. B. The personal unconscious because it stores repressed individual memories. C. The ego because it organizes conscious experience. D. The persona because it is the social mask people wear. Which would you go with? Lock it in before the reveal. The correct answer is A. The collective unconscious, because it holds inherited universal patterns. A is correct because Jung described the collective unconscious as the deepest psychic layer, containing archetypes that are inherited rather than learned and that surface in myths, religions, and dreams across cultures. The recurring hero pattern is one of his classic examples. B is wrong because the personal unconscious holds material from an individual's own life that has been repressed or forgotten. It is unique to each person and cannot account for patterns shared by people from completely different cultures and eras. C is wrong because the ego is the center of conscious awareness in Jung's model, not a reservoir of universal symbols. It would not produce identical motifs across unrelated mythologies. D is wrong because the persona is the outward social mask a person presents to others, like a professional role or public identity. It varies by individual and culture and does not explain shared mythological structures. Beyond the personal unconscious that Freud described lies a deeper layer Jung called the collective unconscious. Psychosocial D564, a shared, inherited stratum of the psyche, present in every human being across all cultures and historical periods. Think of the psyche as having distinct depths. The personal unconscious sits just below awareness and holds material unique to one individual's life. The collective unconscious sits far deeper. It is species-wide, inherited like biological anatomy, and shared regardless of personal history. The collective unconscious works through archetypes, not fixed images, but structuring tendencies that get filled in by a person's culture. The hero might appear as a knight in medieval Europe or a comic book protagonist today, but the underlying template is the same across humanity. Keep three concepts distinct. The personal unconscious is individual, holding one person's repressed memories, closer to Freud. The collective unconscious is shared across all humanity and contains archetypes. The self is one specific archetype within it, representing the goal of integration and wholeness through individuation. When a test scenario describes symbolic patterns recurring across unconnected cultures, patterns no individual could have learned from personal experience, the concept in play is always the collective unconscious, not the personal unconscious or any specific archetype within it. Question 7. A clinician notices that a client repeatedly accuses co-workers of being secretly hostile and untrustworthy, even when no evidence supports the claim. A Jungian framing connects this to a darker, disowned part of the self being seen in others. Which concept fits the framing? Your options are A, the persona, because it represents the social mask. B, the anima, because it is the feminine inner image in a man. C, the self, because it integrates all aspects of personality. D, the shadow, because it holds disowned and projected qualities. Don't overthink it. Which one feels right? The correct answer is D, the shadow, because it holds disowned and projected qualities. D is correct because Jung's shadow contains the qualities a person finds unacceptable in themselves and pushes out of awareness. When those qualities are projected onto others, the person sees outside what they cannot face inside, a dynamic Jung used to explain prejudice and chronic interpersonal conflict. A is wrong because the persona is the public face, the mask of professional or social roles. It is conscious and adaptive rather than disowned, and Jung did not link it to projection of hostility. B is wrong because the anima is the inner feminine image that Jung said operates in men, often surfacing in romantic projection. It is not the seat of disowned hostility or the mechanism behind paranoid attribution. C is wrong because the self in Jungian terms is the unifying archetype, the goal of individuation rather than the source of projection. A person fully in touch with the self would have less need to project shadow material onto others. The shadow is one of Jung's most powerful concepts. and one of the most frequently tested. It refers to everything the conscious ego has rejected, denied, or left undeveloped. Understanding it deeply means understanding how the psyche handles what it cannot accept about itself. Becoming a particular kind of person always means leaving other potentials behind. Those leftovers don't vanish, they form an underside of the personality. Jung saw the shadow as inevitable, a structural feature of having any conscious identity at all. The key clinical mechanism is projection. When a person cannot tolerate a quality in themselves, buried anger, hidden greed, disowned ambition, they begin to see that quality everywhere in others. The miser spots greed in strangers. The person who has buried aggression sees hostility in every colleague's glance. Test questions often pit the shadow against two look-alike concepts. The persona is the outward social mask, consciously built and adaptive. The self is the guiding archetype of wholeness. The shadow is specifically what gets left out when the persona is constructed, pointing inward rather than outward. The clearest signal for shadow on any exam is a person who cannot stop seeing a negative quality in others that they refuse to acknowledge in themselves. Individuation. Jung's lifelong developmental task, erkennen geht sein Oscar-terms, depends on meeting that disowned material directly rather than projecting it outward. Question 8. A woman thinks intensely about an old college friend she has not seen in years. That same afternoon, the friend calls out of the blue. She wonders if the timing is more than chance. A Jungian colleague describes the pattern using a specific term. Which term best matches? Your options are A. Repression, because painful material is forced from awareness. B. Synchronicity, because meaningful coincidences reflect deeper connection. C. Sublimation, because energy is rerouted into accepted channels. D. Compensation, because the unconscious balances conscious life. Got a guess? Lock it in. The correct answer is B. Synchronicity, because meaningful coincidences reflect deeper connection. B is correct because Jung coined synchronicity to describe meaningful coincidences that cannot be explained by ordinary cause and effect. He believes such events arise when forces in the collective unconscious are manifested in the outer world, giving the experience an inner sense of significance. A is wrong because repression refers to keeping painful material out of conscious awareness, usually through defensive forgetting. It does not name a coincidence between inner and outer events. C is wrong because sublimation is a Freudian defense mechanism in which unacceptable impulses are channeled into socially valued activity. It has nothing to do with surprising coincidences in time. D is wrong because compensation in Jung's vocabulary refers to the way unconscious material balances overly one-sided conscious attitudes, often through dreams. It is a process inside the psyche, not a synchronization of inner and outer events. Synchronicity is Jung's term for meaningful coincidences that cannot be explained by ordinary cause and effect. Unlike repression or compensation, which are purely internal mechanisms, synchronicity spans the boundary between the inner psyche and the outer world. 4 features define synchronicity. The coincidence carries felt meaning. No causal chain connects the two events. An inner state and an outer event align at the same moment, and Jung treated that subjective sense of significance as genuine evidence about the psyche. Jung proposed that when an archetype is activated within a person, it can be paralleled by an event in the external world. The inner symbol and the outer event line up not because one caused the other, but because both arise from the same deeper layer, the collective unconscious. The key distinctions to hold: compensation balances one-sided conscious attitudes through unconscious counterweight. It stays inside the psyche. Projection assigns a disowned inner content to another person, also internal. Repression hides material from awareness. Only synchronicity crosses the line between psyche and world. When a scenario involves uncanny timing, prescient dreams, or an inner state that mysteriously matches an outer event. Synchronicity is the union concept at work. If the mechanism stays inside one person's psyche, reach for a different term. Question 9. A man in midlife who has spent decades building a career begins exploring poetry, dreams, and inner symbolism for the first time. A Jungian therapist sees this turn inward as the beginning of a developmental process unique to adulthood. Which concept best describes the process? Your options are A. Latency, because sexual energy is dormant in adulthood. B. Reaction formation, because hidden impulses are converted into opposites. C. Individuation, because unconscious aspects integrate with consciousness. D. Identification, because the man absorbs the values of admired others. Which one is it? Pause the video if you need more time. The correct answer is C. Individuation, because unconscious aspects integrate with consciousness. C is correct, because individuation is Jung's term for the lifelong, especially midlife, process of integrating unconscious material with conscious awareness to become a whole, mature self. The man's turn toward inner symbolism is the classic opening movement of that process. A is wrong, because latency is a Freudian psychosexual stage in childhood, not a Jungian adult process. It also describes a quieting of drives rather than a turn toward inner exploration. B is wrong, because reaction formation is a Freudian defense mechanism in which an unacceptable impulse is replaced by its conscious opposite. It does not fit the slow integrative work the man is undertaking. D is wrong, because identification is a process of taking on the qualities of an admired other. The man is not modeling himself on someone else. He is exploring his own inner life. Individuation is Jung's term for the lifelong work of becoming a whole, genuine self, and it's distinctly different from anything in Freud's framework or humanistic psychology. Individuation is not a childhood stage. It's a lifelong process that intensifies in the second half of life, driven by the need to integrate unconscious material, the shadow, anima or animus, and ultimately the self. The mechanism is the integration of opposites. The ego must encounter the persona, the shadow, and the anima or animus, each encounter widening the self-definition until a deeper, more whole self emerges. The two main confusables are self-actualization, which shares the theme of growth but lacks Jung's depth psychology, and identification, which is a childhood and adolescent process, not a midlife inward turn. When a scenario shows an adult turning inward, drawn to dreams, symbols, or inner exploration after years of outer striving, that's Jung's individuation. The keyword is integration of unconscious material with conscious life. Question 10. A career counselor uses a popular instrument that classifies clients along introversion versus extroversion, sensing versus intuition, thinking versus feeling, and judging versus perceiving. The client asks where the framework comes from. Which theorist's typology forms the historical foundation of this instrument? Your options are A. Carl Jung, who describes psychological types based on attitudes and functions. B. Sigmund Freud, who organized personality into ED, ego, and superego. Say B. F. Skinner, who described behavior in terms of reinforcement schedules. D. Karen Horney, who described moving toward, against, and away from people. Take a second. Which answer would you pick? The correct answer is A. Carl Jung, who described psychological types based on attitudes and functions. A is correct because the Myers-Briggs type indicator was built directly from Carl Jung's typology, which combined the attitude dimension of introversion versus extroversion with the functions of thinking, feeling, sensing, and intuition. The instrument is widely used in business and education and remains anchored in Jung's framework. B is wrong because Freud's idea ego and superego is a structural model of personality, not a typology of psychological preferences. He never proposed a sorting instrument like the one described. C is wrong because Skinner did not work with personality types at all. His framework focuses on observable behavior shaped by reinforcement, which is incompatible with sorting people into stable inner type categories. D is wrong because Horney's 3 interpersonal orientations describe coping styles in response to anxiety, not the 4-dimension framework used by Myers-Briggs. Her work belongs to the relational psychoanalytic tradition rather than to typology. Jung's theory of psychological types is one of the most widely used frameworks in all of psychology, and it traces back to a single book published in 1921. Understanding its structure helps you separate Jung's original theory from the tools built on top of it. The attitude dimension describes where a person's energy flows, inward or outward. The 4 functions describe how a person takes in information and makes evaluations. Every person relies on a dominant function, with the others playing supporting roles. Crossing the 2 attitudes with the 4 functions produces 8 basic types, what Jung called psychotypes. This grid of possibilities became the structural foundation for later personality instruments. Catherine Cook Briggs and Isabel Briggs Myers built on Jung's framework but added a 4th dimension, judging versus perceiving, expanding the system to 16 types. Jung provided the underlying theory. He did not create the Myers-Briggs instrument itself. When a test item asks about the historical foundation of the Myers-Briggs, the answer is Jung. When it asks about traits measured by factor analysis, think Eysenck or the Big Five. Both are trait models, not typologies of attitudes and functions. Question 11. A high school athlete with limited natural talent practices 5 hours a day and eventually leads the team in scoring. An Adlerian counselor explains the drive behind this effort in terms of a fundamental motivation. Which concept best names that motivation? Your options are A. Death instinct, because aggression turns inward without an outlet. B. Reciprocal determinism, because behavior, environment, and cognition interact. C. Psychic determinism, because all behavior has unconscious causes. D. Striving for superiority, because effort moves the person from a felt minus to a felt plus. Before I reveal it, which one do you think is right? The correct answer is D. Striving for superiority, because effort moves the person from a felt minus to a felt plus. D is correct because Adler proposed that the central human motivation is striving from a felt sense of inferiority toward a felt sense of mastery, which he called moving from a felt minus to a felt plus. The athlete's deliberate compensation for limited talent through extra effort is a textbook illustration of this drive. A is wrong because the death instinct is a Freudian concept, not an Adlerian one, and it describes a destructive pull rather than a striving for competence. It does not capture the constructive, goal-directed effort described. B is wrong because reciprocal determinism is Bandura's social cognitive concept describing the mutual influence of behavior, environment, and cognition. It is not Adler's account of motivation. C is wrong because psychic determinism is Freud's idea that mental events have unconscious causes. Adler explicitly moved away from this kind of unconscious determinism toward conscious goals and striving. In Alfred Adler's individual psychology, the engine behind human motivation isn't pleasure or power over others. It's the universal drive to overcome a felt sense of limitation. Adler called this striving for superiority, and he meant something precise by it. Every person starts life acutely aware of being smaller and weaker than the adults around them. Adler argued this felt minus isn't a defect, it's the natural starting point. The drive to overcome it shapes the whole personality. The same starting motivation can lead in two very different directions. In the healthy path, the felt minus becomes fuel for skill building and meaningful contribution. In the unhealthy path, it curdles into domination, grandiose display, or complete withdrawal. It helps to hold three concepts apart. Striving for superiority is the healthy universal drive everyone has. The inferiority complex is when that drive gets overwhelmed and collapses. The superiority complex is when hidden inferiority gets masked by grandiose behavior. The most common mistake is reading superiority as narcissistic dominance. Adler used the word technically as. It means rising above your own earlier, more limited state. When a scenario shows someone converting a felt limitation into purposeful effort, that's healthy Adlerian striving. Question 12. A family therapist working with 3 siblings notices that the oldest is conscientious and serious. The youngest seems pampered and charming, and the middle child often feels overlooked. The therapist draws on a theorist who emphasized the influence of birth position on personality. Which theorist is the source? Your options are A. Karen Horney, who emphasized basic anxiety and 3 coping styles. B. Alfred Adler, who emphasized birth order and family constellation. C. Erikson, who emphasized 8 stages of psychosocial development. D. Carl Rogers, who emphasized unconditional positive regard. What's your answer? Commit to one before I continue. The correct answer is B. Alfred Adler, who emphasized birth order and family constellation. B is correct because Adler made family constellation, especially birth order, a central piece of his theory, arguing that the position a child occupies within the family shapes the style of life that develops. The pattern the therapist observes maps onto Adler's classic descriptions of oldest, middle, and youngest dynamics. A is wrong because Horney emphasized parent-child interactions and 3 interpersonal orientations rather than the influence of birth position. She did not build a sibling order framework. C is wrong because Erikson focused on age-linked psychosocial crises across the lifespan, not on birth order. His framework treats the age and stage of the person, not their position among siblings, as a central variable. D is wrong because Rogers focused on the conditions for healthy self-development through unconditional positive regard. He did not develop a birth order framework or treat family constellation as a major influence. One of Adler's most original contributions was his insight that a child's position among siblings shapes personality in lasting ways. He called this broader framework the family constellation, not just birth order, but the whole web of relationships a child navigates at home. Each position creates a characteristic situation. The oldest enjoys undivided attention until dethronement by a new sibling, often producing conscientiousness. The middle child enters ready-made competition, often developing social skill or ambition. The youngest, treated as the baby, can become charming and confident. The only child, never displaced, grows comfortable with adults but may struggle among peers. The mechanism is situational, not deterministic. Adler used dethronement to describe the oldest child's loss of exclusive attention, and style of life to name the personality pattern that grows from each child's unique family situation. He never claimed a strict prediction, only that position shapes the developmental pressures a child faces. Knowing which theory applies is straightforward once you identify the central variable. Adler organizes development around which sibling position a child occupies. Erikson organizes it around which age-linked stage the person is passing through. Attachment theory focuses on the quality of the early parent-child bond. Same family, very different lenses. Question 13. An Adlerian therapist evaluates whether a new client is psychologically healthy by looking at how connected the client feels to other people, how much the client contributes to the welfare of the wider community, and how the client approaches work, friendship, and intimacy. Which Adlerian concept is the therapist using as the central marker of health? Your options are A. Social interest, because connection to others is the key sign of psychological health. B. The shadow, because integrating disowned material brings wholeness. C. The actualizing tendency, because growth proceeds when conditions are right. D. Cognitive affective units, because situational responses define the person. Pick one. Trust your gut. Here's your chance to test yourself. The correct answer is A. Social interest, because connection to others is the key sign of psychological health. A is correct because Adler argued that social interest, the felt connection to others and the willingness to contribute to the common good, is the core measure of psychological health. He described the healthy person as one who succeeds in the 3 life tasks of work, love, and social interaction, exactly the focus the therapist is taking. B is wrong because the shadow is a Jungian concept, not an Adlerian one, and refers to disowned material rather than relational engagement. Integrating shadow material is a Jungian goal, not Adler's marker of health. C is wrong because the actualizing tendency belongs to Carl Rogers and refers to an inner drive toward growth. While related to health, it is not Adler's relational measure. D is wrong because cognitive affective units come from Michel's CAPS model and describe situation-specific responses. They have no place in Adler's framework of health. Alfred Adler proposed that the truest measure of psychological health isn't insight into the unconscious or inner harmony. It's the depth of a person's genuine connection to others and commitment to the wider community. Adler called this quality Gemeinschaftsgefühl, a felt sense of belonging to the human community. He believed it was not fixed at birth but cultivated through experience, and that most adult psychological problems trace back to its underdevelopment. Adler argued that mental health reveals itself across 3 life tasks: work, love, and friendship. Success in each means genuine contribution to others. Withdrawal from any of them signals that social interest has not taken root. Adler was careful to distinguish social interest from mere friendliness or extroversion. A socially smooth person who acts only for personal advantage lacks it entirely, while a quiet person whose life is oriented toward genuine contribution embodies it fully. Where Freud looked inward to unconscious conflict and humanists looked upward to self-actualization, Adler looked outward to how much a person's life is genuinely given over to the welfare of others. Question 14. An adult client describes a recurring pattern across friendships, jobs, and family. Always wanting to be in charge, always feeling let down by others, always returning to the same disappointing scripts. An Adlerian therapist sees this as a unifying pattern shaping the client's whole life. Which concept best names that pattern? Your options are A. Source traits, because they form the deep structure of personality. B. Defense mechanisms, because they protect the ego from anxiety. C. Style of life, because it is the unifying personal pattern Adler described. D. Anima, because the inner feminine influences relational tendencies. Which would you go with? Lock it in before the reveal. The correct answer is C. Style of life, because it is the unifying personal pattern Adler described. C is correct because Adler used style of life to name the unifying personal pattern that runs through a person's relationships, work, and goals. The client's repeating script across multiple life domains is what Adler considered the visible expression of style of life. A is wrong because source traits are Cattell's deep structural traits identified through factor analysis. They belong to a different theoretical tradition and are not the integrative narrative pattern Adler described. B is wrong because defense mechanisms are Freudian ego strategies for managing anxiety. They are protective tactics, not a unifying life pattern. D is wrong because the enema is a Jungian archetype, the inner feminine image in a man. It does not describe a global, repeating life pattern across all domains. Alfred Adler believed that every person develops a single unifying pattern that runs through all areas of their life. He called this the style of life, a characteristic way of moving through the world that integrates goals, assumptions, and strategies into one coherent whole. Style of life is broader than any single trait or defense. It encompasses goals, assumptions, strategies, and relational patterns all woven together, and Adler believed this pattern crystallizes surprisingly early in childhood. Rather than seeing each life domain in isolation, Adler insisted the same underlying pattern shows up everywhere. The same script that plays out in friendships also appears at work, in romance, and in how a person responds to failure. Adler resisted Freud's view of personality as warring parts. Instead, he saw one organizing theme, and the job of therapy is to make that theme visible so the person can revise it. When a scenario describes a repeating script across multiple life domains, style of life is the concept being tested. If it's a single defensive response, think defense mechanism. If it's a future goal image, think fictional finalism. Style of life is always the integrated whole. Question 15. An Adlerian counselor talks with a client about the imagined future the client is unconsciously moving toward. An image of being respected, financially independent, and surrounded by admiring colleagues. The counselor describes this as the goal that guides current behavior. Which Adlerian concept names this guiding image? Your options are A. Reaction formation, because it converts an impulse into its opposite. B. Fictional finalism, because the imagined future goal organizes present behavior. C. The collective unconscious, because it shapes universal striving. D. Reciprocal determinism, because behavior and environment shape each other. Don't overthink it. Which one feels right? The correct answer is B. Fictional finalism, because the imagined future goal organizes present behavior. B is correct because Adler used fictional finalism to name the imagined future goal, often unconscious, that pulls a person's present behavior into a coherent direction. The counselor is naming exactly this image of a future self that organizes the client's current effort. A is wrong because reaction formation is a Freudian defense mechanism in which an unacceptable impulse is replaced by its conscious opposite. It is not a future-oriented goal. C is wrong because the collective unconscious is Jung's reservoir of inherited universal symbols. It is not a personal imagined future that organizes one individual's behavior. D is wrong because reciprocal determinism is Bandura's account of how behavior, person, and environment mutually influence each other. It does not name a guiding future image. Fictional finalism is one of Alfred Adler's most distinctive ideas. It describes how an imagined future goal, often unconscious, organizes everything a person does in the present. Adler took this idea from philosopher Hans Weihinger, who argued humans treat useful fictions as if they were real. Adler applied this to personality. People act as if their imagined future self already defines them, whether that image is accurate or not. Unlike most theories that explain behavior through past causes, fictional finalism is teleological. The imagined future pulls present action forward. A person who pictures herself as a respected leader behaves now as if she already has some claim on that role. Keep three concepts distinct. Fictional finalism is Adler's forward-looking personal goal image. Reaction formation is a Freudian defense hiding an impulse behind its opposite. The collective unconscious is Jung's shared reservoir of universal inherited symbols, not a personal future goal. In Adlerian therapy, making the fictional goal conscious is the turning point. Once the guiding image is visible, a person can evaluate it and choose whether to keep it or replace it with something better. Question 16. A pediatric nurse caring for an infant notices that consistent, responsive feeding and comforting tend to predict a calmer, more easily soothed baby over the following months. An instructor draws on Erikson to explain the long-term significance. Which crisis is being navigated during this earlier stage? Your options are A. Initiative versus guilt because the child takes on bold tasks. B. Autonomy versus shame and doubt because the toddler asserts will. C. Identity versus identity confusion because adolescence demands a coherent self. D. Trust versus mistrust because consistent care builds basic trust in the world. Got a guess? Lock it in. The correct answer is D. Trust versus mistrust because consistent care builds basic trust in the world. D is correct because Erikson placed trust versus mistrust in the first year of life, when consistent and responsive caregiving builds the basic trust that the world is reliable. The instructor is describing the foundation of this stage. A is wrong because initiative versus guilt is the third stage, roughly ages 3 to 6, when the preschool-aged child begins planning and undertaking activities. It does not describe infancy. B is wrong because autonomy versus shame and doubt is the second stage, the toddler years, when the child experiments with independent action. It comes after the infant stage being described. C is wrong because identity versus identity confusion is the adolescent stage, focused on forming a coherent sense of self. It is far removed from the infant care described. Erikson's first psychosocial stage centers on a simple but profound question: is the world a safe place? The answer an infant arrives at depends almost entirely on the caregiving they receive in that first year of life. Erikson kept Freud's stage framework but made 3 major changes. He extended development across the full lifespan, replaced psychosexual conflict with psychosocial crisis, and defined each stage by an ego strength that healthy resolution produces. Each time hunger or distress arises and a caregiver reliably responds, the infant's nervous system builds a working assumption: signals are worth sending, and the world answers them. When care is inconsistent or harsh, the opposite assumption takes root: the world is unreliable. A critical point Erikson stressed is that healthy resolution does not mean pure, unlimited trust. A child who is warmly trusting yet appropriately cautious has resolved this stage well. The goal is for trust to dominate, producing hope, the belief that effort and connection bring something good. Keep these early stages distinct. Trust versus mistrust belongs to infancy and caregiver responsiveness. Autonomy versus shame and doubt belongs to toddler-era independence. Initiative versus guilt belongs to preschool age planning. When a scenario centers on infant care patterns, trust versus mistrust is always the right Erikson stage. Question 17. A high school senior wrestles openly with what to study in college, who they want to become, and which values from family, friends, and culture to keep or set aside. An Erikson-informed school counselor names the developmental crisis the student is in. Which crisis fits? Your options are A. Identity versus identity confusion, because adolescence centers on forming a coherent self. B. Industry versus inferiority, because the school-age child seeks competence. C. Generativity versus stagnation, because middle adulthood centers on contribution. D. Integrity versus despair, because late life centers on reviewing one's life. Which one is it? Pause the video if you need more time. The correct answer is A. Identity versus identity confusion, because adolescence centers on forming a coherent self. A is correct because identity versus identity confusion is Erikson's adolescent stage, in which the young person works out a coherent sense of who they are by exploring values, roles, and commitments. The senior's open wrestling with future direction and inherited values is the central work of this stage. B is wrong because industry versus inferiority is the elementary school stage, focused on building competence and skills and schoolwork. It comes well before the identity work described. C is wrong because generativity versus stagnation is the middle adult stage, focused on contributing to the next generation through work, mentorship, or family. The student is not yet at that life position. D is wrong because integrity versus despair is the final stage when older adults look back on their lives. It does not describe an adolescent at the start of adult choices. Erikson's fifth stage centers on the central task of adolescence, forging a coherent sense of self. It sits between the competence building of childhood and the intimate partnerships of young adulthood. James Marcia refined Erikson's theory by mapping 4 identity statuses: identity achievement, serious exploration, followed by chosen commitment, is the healthiest path. Foreclosure skips exploration entirely. Moratorium explores without committing, and diffusion involves neither. Identity sits precisely between industry and intimacy in Erikson's framework. Industry is about building competence in childhood. Identity is about integrating a coherent self in adolescence. Intimacy, in forming close partnerships, depends on having a stable identity to bring into the relationship. Identity formation is not simply a private internal process. The adolescent is actively negotiating with parents, peers, schools, and culture about who to become, integrating dimensions of gender, sexuality, and ethnic identity into a workable whole. When a scenario shows someone wrestling with who they are and who they want to become, that is identity work. Keep it distinct from industry, which is about competence, and intimacy, which is about close partnerships forged after a self is in place. Question 18. A 45-year-old engineer mentors 3 junior staff, coaches a youth sports team on weekends, and recently joined a board to support a local nonprofit. An Erikson-informed colleague describes this as healthy progress through a particular crisis. Which stage best fits? Your options are A. Autonomy versus shame and doubt because the toddler asserts independence. B. Intimacy versus isolation because young adulthood centers on close partnerships. C. Generativity versus stagnation because middle adulthood centers on contribution. D. Industry versus inferiority because school-age children build competence. Take a second. Which answer would you pick? The correct answer is C. Generativity versus stagnation because middle adulthood centers on contribution. C is correct because generativity versus stagnation is the middle adult stage, when adults invest in mentoring, parenting, and contributing to the next generation and to their community. The engineer's pattern of mentoring, coaching, and civic involvement is precisely what Erikson described as healthy generativity. A is wrong because autonomy versus shame and doubt belongs to the toddler years and does not apply to a midlife adult building community contributions. B is wrong because intimacy versus isolation is the young adult stage, focused on forming deep partnerships. While important earlier, it is not the central crisis at midlife. D is wrong because industry versus inferiority is the school age stage, when children develop a sense of competence through schoolwork and skills. It is far removed from middle adulthood. Generativity versus stagnation is Erikson's 7th crisis, defining the middle adult years from roughly 40 to 65. The central question is whether a person will invest meaningfully in the world beyond themselves or turn inward toward comfort and self-focus. The generative adult channels energy into parenting, mentoring, teaching, or building institutions, anything that will outlast them. Stagnation leaves a creeping sense of emptiness. The strength that emerges from healthy resolution is care. Erikson's concept is broader than parenting alone. A childless teacher, a senior nurse training new graduates, or a volunteer coaching youth sports can all be deeply generative. What matters is the sustained investment of time, expertise, and care in something larger than personal advancement. The two most common confusables are intimacy versus isolation and integrity versus despair. Intimacy belongs to young adulthood and centers on close partnerships. Integrity belongs to late adulthood and centers on accepting one's life as a whole. Generativity sits squarely in the middle. Look for a midlife adult contributing to the next generation. Whenever a scenario features a middle-aged adult mentoring, building community, or actively parenting as an investment rather than a chore, generativity is the answer. Age and task together are your fastest sorting tool. Question 19. A hospice nurse notices that some elderly patients speak warmly about the lives they have lived, accept regrets without bitterness, and feel a quiet sense of meaning, while others fall into bitter rumination over what cannot be undone. Erikson framed this contrast as a final psychosocial crisis. Which crisis? Your options are A. Initiative versus guilt, because preschool-age children plan bold projects. B. Integrity versus despair, because late life centers on reviewing one's life. C. Trust versus mistrust, because infancy depends on consistent caregiving. D. Identity versus identity confusion, because adolescence forms a coherent self. Before I reveal it, which one do you think is right? The correct answer is B. Integrity versus despair, because late life centers on reviewing one's life. B is correct because integrity versus despair is Erikson's final stage, in which older adults look back on their lives. Resolution toward integrity brings acceptance and a quiet sense of meaning, while the failure to resolve produces bitterness and despair, exactly the contrast the nurse observes. A is wrong, because initiative versus guilt belongs to early childhood and concerns the preschooler's confidence in starting projects. It does not describe end-of-life reflection. C is wrong because trust versus mistrust belongs to infancy and depends on caregiver responsiveness. It is the very first crisis, not the final one. D is wrong because identity versus identity confusion is the adolescent stage. It does not capture the life review described in older patients. The eighth and final stage in Erikson's framework is integrity versus despair, the great reckoning of late adulthood. Its central task is life review, looking back across an entire lifetime and judging whether it was worth living. Integrity doesn't require a perfect life. It requires that failures, joys, relationships, and regrets be woven into a meaningful whole. The person sees a life that for all its flaws was theirs, and that acceptance produces wisdom. Both paths begin at the same place, life review. But the direction of resolution determines everything. Integrity brings quiet meaning. Despair brings the haunting sense that the life as a whole was a mistake with no time left to correct it. A common mistake is equating Erikson's despair with sadness or grief. An older adult who grieves losses but still finds meaning in the life lived is not in despair. Despair is the felt conviction that the entire life went wrong and cannot be repaired. Whenever a scenario features an older adult reflecting on the value of their whole life, with acceptance, bitterness, or anything in between, that is integrity versus despair. Generativity belongs to midlife mentors. Trust belongs to infants. This stage belongs to the end of the lifespan. Question 20. A 9-year-old who consistently struggles with reading begins avoiding schoolwork, calling himself dumb, and shrinking back from classroom challenges where peers have started to excel. An Erikson-informed teacher describes the developmental crisis the child is failing to resolve. Which crisis fits? Your options are A. Trust versus mistrust, because infancy depends on consistent caregiving. B. Intimacy versus isolation, because young adulthood centers on partnerships. C. Generativity versus stagnation, because midlife centers on contribution. D. Industry versus inferiority, because school-age children build a sense of competence. What's your answer? Commit to one before I continue. The correct answer is D. Industry versus inferiority, because school-age children build a sense of competence. D is correct because industry versus inferiority is Erikson's school-age stage, roughly ages 6 to 12, when children build a sense of competence through schoolwork and peer comparison. A child who repeatedly fails academically and sees peers succeed is at risk of resolving the stage toward inferiority. A is wrong because trust versus mistrust belongs to the first year of life and centers on caregiver responsiveness. The scenario takes place years later in school. B is wrong because intimacy versus isolation belongs to young adulthood and centers on close relationships. A 9-year-old has not yet entered this stage. C is wrong because generativity versus stagnation belongs to middle adulthood and centers on contribution to the next generation. It does not apply to a school-age child. Erikson's fourth stage, industry versus inferiority, spans roughly ages 6 to 12, the elementary school years. The central developmental task is building a felt sense of competence. A critical insight is that industry is not limited to school performance. Any sustained, skill-demanding activity, music, sports, shows, community roles, can be the arena where a child builds or fails to build competence. What matters is effort, feedback, and recognition. What makes the stage distinct is its comparative mechanism. For the first time, the child is evaluated against peers and external standards, academic, athletic, social, or artistic. Out of that ongoing comparison emerges a settled sense of where one stands and whether effort is worth investing. Keep the neighboring stages distinct. Initiative versus guilt is the preschool stage, focused on confidence in starting things. Identity versus identity confusion is adolescence, focused on a coherent sense of self. Industry sits between them, is school age, skill building, peer comparison. On exam items, the signal is a school-age child either mastering skills and gaining confidence or struggling while peers advance. Wherever the felt sense of competence is being built or broken down, that is industry versus inferiority. Question 21. A clinician working with an adult who grew up with cold and rejecting parents notices that the client struggles with a deep, free-floating sense of unease in relationships, expecting hostility even from people who have shown him kindness. A Horney-informed framework would describe the origin of this pervasive unease using a specific term. Which term fits? Your options are A. Basic anxiety, because parental rejection produces a pervasive insecurity in childhood. B. Penis envy, because the female develops a sense of biological inferiority. C. Death instinct, because aggression turns inward across the lifespan. D. Self-actualization, because the inner drive toward growth has been blocked. Pick one. Trust your gut. Here's your chance to test yourself. The correct answer is A. Basic anxiety, because parental rejection produces a pervasive insecurity in childhood. A is correct because Horney described basic anxiety as the deep insecurity that develops in a child who experiences parental rejection or neglect. It produces an underlying expectation that the world is hostile and shapes how the adult approaches relationships, exactly the pattern the clinician observes. B is wrong because penis envy is a Freudian concept Horney explicitly rejected. She challenged the idea that female development was driven by biological inferiority and pointed to social conditions instead. C is wrong because the death instinct is a late Freudian concept describing a pull toward destruction. It is not Horny's term for the pervasive insecurity rooted in early relationships. D is wrong because self-actualization is a humanistic concept central to Maslow and Rogers. It names a growth process rather than the early origin of anxiety. Basic anxiety is Karen Horney's explanation for how early relational failure shapes adult personality. It's not a specific fear. It's a pervasive, background sense of insecurity that begins in childhood and follows us into every relationship we form. Basic anxiety develops when a child's early caregivers fail to provide reliable warmth and protection. Cold, harsh, inconsistent, or rejecting parenting teaches the child that the world is hostile and people cannot be trusted. Because the child cannot safely express hostility toward the caregivers on whom survival depends, that hostility is suppressed. The anxiety remains, and over time the child develops coping strategies, the three interpersonal orientations that crystallize into adult personality. It's critical to distinguish basic anxiety from ordinary phobias. Basic anxiety has no specific trigger. It's the felt background condition an adult carries into every interaction. A free-floating unease rooted in early caregiving rather than any particular threat. Basic anxiety is distinctly Horny's contribution, not Freudian drives, not humanistic growth, but the deep relational wound left when early caregiving fails. When you see pervasive, diffuse insecurity rooted in childhood relationships, you're looking at basic anxiety. Question 20. A new client has spent decades trying to win approval by being agreeable, deferential, and self-sacrificing in every relationship. A Horny-informed therapist describes this as one of three interpersonal orientations developed in response to basic anxiety. Which orientation fits? Your options are A. Moving against people because the person seeks dominance and control. B. Moving away from people because the person seeks emotional distance. C. Moving toward people because the person seeks safety through compliance and approval. D. Moving across people because the person seeks novelty and shifting roles. Which would you go with? Lock it in before the reveal. The correct answer is C. Moving toward people because the person seeks safety through compliance and approval. C is correct because moving toward people, sometimes called the self-effacing solution, is the orientation in which a person manages basic anxiety by becoming compliant, deferential, and approval-seeking. The client's lifelong pattern of self-sacrifice and agreeableness is a textbook description of this orientation. A is wrong because moving against people is the expansive solution, expressed as dominance, hostility, and the pursuit of power. The client described as doing the opposite, suppressing assertion in favor of compliance. B is wrong because moving away from people is the resignation solution, expressed as emotional withdrawal and a wish for self-sufficiency. The client described as highly engaged with others, just in a self-effacing way. D is wrong because moving across people is not one of Horny's three orientations. The framework includes only moving toward, against, and away. Karen Horney described three interpersonal orientations, each a strategy the developing child uses to manage basic anxiety in an unsafe relational world. Understanding all three helps us see why moving toward people is a rigid, anxiety-driven pattern and not simply warmth or kindness. The three orientations are moving toward, against, and away from people. Each one organizes the personality around a different interpersonal strategy. The healthy person shifts flexibly among all three. The neurotic person becomes locked into one and cannot adapt. All three orientations share the same underlying source, basic anxiety, but different how that anxiety is managed interpersonally. Moving toward people, or the self-effacing solution, channels anxiety into compliance and approval seeking. Moving against channels it into dominance, while moving away channels it into emotional withdrawal. The internal cost of the self-effacing solution is significant. The person learns that approval brings safety and disagreement brings rejection. So they become endlessly accommodating. Over time, they suppress their own anger and lose access to their genuine desires, accumulating resentment they cannot safely express. The critical clinical distinction is rigidity. Ordinary warmth is flexible. A person can be warm and still set limits. The self-effacing solution is inflexible. The person cannot say no, cannot tolerate disapproval, and organizes every relationship around the other person's preferences to keep anxiety at bay. Question 23. A talented professional who privately fears being inadequate constructs an internal image of being brilliant, beloved, and beyond criticism, and reacts with intense anger when reality does not match. A horny-informed therapist describes this construction in a specific way. Which concept fits? Your options are A. The persona, because it is the social mask presented to the world. B. The idealized self, because the neurotic constructs a glorified self-image to cope with anxiety. C. The actualizing tendency, because the inner drive pushes toward growth. D. Reaction formation, because the impulse is converted into its opposite. Don't overthink it. Which one feels right? The correct answer is B. The idealized self, because the neurotic constructs a glorified self-image to cope with anxiety. B is correct because Horney described the idealized self as a glorified inner image, the neurotic constructs to compensate for deep insecurity. It produces rage when reality contradicts the idealized picture, exactly the pattern in the scenario. A is wrong because the persona is Jung's concept of the social mask. It is generally adaptive and conscious, not the inner glorification that drives Horney's neurotic dynamic. C is wrong because the actualizing tendency belongs to Rogers and refers to a healthy inner drive toward growth. It is not a defensive overinflation of the self. D is wrong because reaction formation is a Freudian defense mechanism in which an unacceptable impulse is replaced by its conscious opposite. It does not describe the construction of a glorified self-image. Karen Horney's concept of the idealized self explains a paradox. People who appear most confident can be the most psychologically fragile. The idealized self is a glorified inner image constructed not from genuine strength, but to compensate for deep insecurity. Horney distinguishes the real self, your actual strengths and limits, from the idealized self, a fantasy of perfect competence or virtue. Basic anxiety is the engine underneath. The idealized image is built to paper over that fragile foundation. The gap between the idealized image and the real self is, in Horney's view, the engine of adult suffering. The neurotic measures the real self against an impossible standard and always falls short, producing self-contempt and what Horney called the tyranny of the should. The key clinical signal is rigidity. A person with healthy aspirations takes feedback as useful. A person identified with the idealized self experiences the same feedback as a personal attack. The anger is protecting an image, not a real self. Don't confuse the idealized self with Jung's persona or Rogers' actualizing tendency. The idealized self is uniquely Hornian, defensively constructed, compensating for anxiety, and making the person more brittle with every reality that dares to contradict it. Question 24. A pediatric researcher follows infants and finds that those whose caregivers respond consistently to distress tend to use the caregiver as a secure base, exploring the room and returning when stressed. The researcher links this pattern to a tradition in developmental theory. Which tradition is the source? Your options are A. Operant conditioning, because behavior is shaped by reinforcement. B. Trait theory, because temperament is heritable. C. Self-actualization theory, because growth proceeds when conditions are right. D. A attachment theory because early caregiver responsiveness shapes lifelong relational patterns. Got a guess? Lock it in. The correct answer is D. Attachment theory because early caregiver responsiveness shapes lifelong relational patterns. D is correct because attachment theory, rooted in the relational and object relations tradition, describes how early infant caregiver responsiveness produces secure or insecure attachment styles that shape relationships across the lifespan. The secure base behavior the researcher observes is the classic marker of secure attachment. A is wrong because operant conditioning, associated with Skinner, focuses on how reinforcement shapes specific behaviors. It does not frame the parent-child bond as a developmental attachment relationship. B is wrong because trait theory focuses on stable individual characteristics, often heritable. It does not center on caregiver responsiveness or the secure base concept. C is wrong because self-actualization theory belongs to humanistic psychology and concerns adult growth toward potential. It does not describe infant caregiver bonds. Attachment theory explains how early bonds with caregivers create lasting templates for relationships throughout life. Developed by John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth, it argues that humans are biologically prepared to form selective bonds in infancy. Ainsworth's strange situation studies identified distinct attachment patterns. Secure attachment emerges from consistent responsive caregiving. Inconsistent or rejecting care produces anxious or avoidant patterns, each reflecting a different internal working model of what relationships provide. Through repeated interactions, the infant constructs an internal working model, a mental template of what relationships are like, what the self deserves, and what others can be expected to provide. This model quietly guides relational choices well into adulthood. A crucial point, attachment patterns are not permanent. Major caregiving disruption can shift a secure child toward insecurity, while sustained relational repair can move an insecure child toward security. Attachment theory predicts statistical patterns across populations, not locked-in outcomes for individuals. Question 25. An anthropologist points out that the rules for what makes a healthy adult differ widely across cultures, with some societies expecting independence and others expecting strong family interdependence. A horny informed psychologist would say this difference matters because culture is a major determinant of personality. Which claim best captures Horny's position? Your options are: A. Culture is a primary shaper of personality alongside parent-child relationships. B. Personality is shaped almost entirely by reinforcement schedules in any culture. C. Personality is fixed by biology and largely independent of culture. D. Culture is a minor influence compared with the universal Oedipus complex. Which one is it? Pause the video if you need more time. The correct answer is A. Culture is a primary shaper of personality alongside parent-child relationships. A is correct because Horny emphasized that personality develops through both early parent-child relationships and the broader cultural context, treating culture as a primary determinant. She argued that parenting patterns and even gender roles vary by culture, and that personality cannot be understood apart from those cultural conditions. B is wrong because behaviorist views like reinforcement schedule explanations come from Skinner and the operant tradition, not Horny. She rejected the idea that personality could be explained without attention to cultural context. C is wrong because A position that personality is fixed by biology is closer to certain trait or biological theories. Horny explicitly opposed reducing personality to biology and treated cultural conditions as essential. D is wrong because Horny challenged Freud's emphasis on the universal Oedipus complex, arguing that he had mistaken culturally specific patterns for universals. She did not treat the Oedipus complex as the dominant force. Karen Horney placed culture at the center of personality theory. Her core argument was that personality cannot be understood in isolation from the cultural conditions in which it develops. Horney described a clear mechanism: cultural conditions shape parenting practices. Parenting shapes early relational experience, and that experience organizes personality. The chain runs through real social conditions, not through universal biological drives. An anthropologist comparing cultures reveals why Horney rejected universal norms. What counts as a healthy adult differs dramatically across societies. Independence valued in one culture, interdependence in another. A Horney-informed psychologist treats both as valid adaptations to particular cultural conditions. Horney is sometimes misread as saying personality is nothing but culture. She did not dismiss biology or development. She insisted culture is a primary determinant alongside early relationships, not the sole cause. When a scenario emphasizes culture as a major shaper of personality alongside parent-child relationships, Horney is the theorist in view, distinct from Skinner's reinforcement schedules and from purely biological accounts. Question 26. A teacher describes a student whose entire personality seems organized around a single defining drive. Every choice, hobby, and friendship reflects an obsession with becoming a famous performer. An Allport-informed colleague names this rare, all-consuming kind of trait. Which type of trait fits? Your options are: A. Source trait, because it sits at the deep structural level identified by factor analysis. B. Surface trait, because it is observable but does not reflect underlying structure. C. Cardinal trait, because it organizes the entire personality around a single ruling passion. D. Secondary trait, because it appears only in narrow situations. Take a second. Which answer would you pick? The correct answer is C. Cardinal trait, because it organizes the entire personality around a single ruling passion. C is correct because Allport used cardinal trait to name a rare, dominating disposition that organizes a person's entire life around a single defining passion. The student's all-consuming pursuit of fame is a textbook example of a cardinal trait. A is wrong because source trait is Cattell's concept, not Allport's, and refers to the deep traits identified through factor analysis. It does not describe the all-encompassing personal passion Allport called cardinal. B is wrong because surface trait is also a Cattell concept, referring to observable clusters that do not reflect underlying structure. It is not the right Allport category. D is wrong because secondary traits in Allport's framework appear only in specific situations, like a particular preference. They are the opposite of an all-encompassing organizing trait. Gordon Allport organized personality into a three-level hierarchy, with cardinal traits at the very top. These are not simply strong interests or dominant qualities. They represent something far rarer and more total. A cardinal trait is a single ruling passion so powerful that it shapes every domain of a person's life: career, relationships, hobbies, daily choices. Allport stressed that this level of total organization is genuinely exceptional, not just intense focus on one area. Think of a person whose every choice, who they befriend, what they study, how they spend weekends, traces back to one defining passion. Allport's examples include Albert Schweitzer, whose entire life was organized around reverence for life, and the figure of Don Juan, organized entirely around seduction. Cardinal traits sit above central traits, the handful of broad adjectives a friend might use to describe you, and well above secondary traits, which are narrow and situational. The hierarchy gives Allport a vocabulary for describing how breadth and influence vary within a single personality. The most common mistake is applying the cardinal label too easily. Intense career focus or a deep hobby does not qualify. The entire personality must be genuinely subordinated to a single defining passion. That is the rare case Allport designed the cardinal trait concept to capture. Question 27. A co-worker is generally easygoing in most settings, but becomes oddly tense and irritable, specifically when talking about car repairs. An Allport-informed colleague describes this narrow situational tendency in a specific way. Which type of trait fits? Your options are A. Cardinal trait, because it dominates the entire personality. B. Secondary trait, because it appears only in narrow circumstances. C. Source trait, because it lies at the deep structural level. D. Central trait, because it is one of a handful of major dispositions. Before I reveal it, which one do you think is right? The correct answer is B. Secondary trait, because it appears only in narrow circumstances. B is correct because secondary traits in Allport's framework appear only in specific circumstances and do not describe how a person behaves overall. The co-worker's tension specifically around car repairs fits this narrow situational pattern. A is wrong because cardinal traits dominate the whole personality and shape every domain. The co-worker described shows a narrow context-bound reaction, not a life-organizing passion. C is wrong because source traits belong to Cattell, not Allport, and refer to deep factor analytic structures rather than situation-specific reactions. D is wrong because central traits in Allport's framework are the handful of broad descriptors that capture a person's general personality. They are broader than the narrow situational reaction described. Gordon Allport organized personality into 3 levels of breadth. Understanding where secondary traits sit in this hierarchy is the key to applying it correctly. Cardinal traits sit at the top am, a single ruling passion that organizes an entire life. Central traits are the handful of broad descriptors most people would use to describe someone. Secondary traits occupy the bottom, real and stable, but confined to specific situations and irrelevant everywhere else. Secondary traits add color and individuality to a personality without defining it. They are the narrow flavors that round out the picture rather than the core ingredients that explain the whole dish. The diagnostic signal for a secondary trait is contextual narrowness. If a description applies only in a specific situation and the person behaves differently everywhere else, the disposition is secondary, not central, not cardinal. Breadth of influence is exactly what separates the 3 levels. Whenever a scenario describes a tendency that shows up only in one context and does not characterize the person overall, Allport's label is secondary trait. The hierarchy is entirely about how broadly a trait organizes personality, and secondary sits at the narrow end. Question 28. A research team trying to identify the smallest set of underlying factors that account for hundreds of observed personality descriptors uses a statistical technique to reduce the data. The result is a model with 16 primary dimensions. Which theorist's approach is most clearly being followed? Your options are A. Sigmund Freud, who built psychoanalysis around unconscious conflict. B. Carl Rogers, who built person-centered therapy around unconditional positive regard. C. Karen Horney, who built relational theory around basic anxiety. D. Raymond Cattell, who used factor analysis to identify 16 source traits. What's your answer? Commit to one before I continue. The correct answer is D. Raymond Cattell, who used factor analysis to identify 16 source traits. D is correct because Cattell pioneered the use of factor analysis to identify what he called source traits, the deep structural dimensions of personality, and produced the 16-factor model along with the 60PF questionnaire, the team's method and the 16-factor result point directly to his approach. A is wrong because Freud worked through clinical case study and dream analysis, not statistical reduction of trait descriptors. His framework is dynamic, not psychometrics. B is wrong because Rogers worked from clinical practice and humanistic theory, not factor analysis. The 16-factor structure is foreign to his framework. C is wrong because Horney worked within the relational psychoanalytic tradition. She did not build a factor analytic trait model. Raymond Cattell pioneered a data-driven approach to personality science, arguing that rigorous statistical methods, not clinical intuition, should reveal the true structure of human personality. Factor analysis works by detecting which trait descriptors tend to rise and fall together across people. Cattell fed enormous datasets of self-reports, observer ratings, and behavioral measures into this method to uncover the deeper structure beneath surface behavior. Cattell distinguished between surface traits, the visible behavioral patterns we can observe, and source traits, the deeper underlying dimensions that factor analysis uncovers. The 16 source traits are the true building blocks of personality in his system. It is easy to confuse these three models because all use factor analysis, but they are distinct. Cattell's 16 personality factor questionnaire produces 16 primary dimensions. The 5-factor model produces 5 broad ocean dimensions. Eysenck's Penn model yields just 3 superordinate factors with a strong biological emphasis. Whenever a question mentions 16 factors, source traits, or the 16 personality factor questionnaire, Cattell is the theorist. His legacy is showing that personality structure can be discovered mathematically, laying the groundwork for the entire trait tradition that followed. Question 29. A graduate seminar contrasts 2 approaches to studying personality. One searches for general laws that apply across people, while the other studies the unique patterns of one individual in depth. An Allport informed instructor names this pair of approaches. Which pair best matches? Your options are nomothetic and idiographic, because the first seeks general laws and the second studies the individual case. B. Conscious and unconscious, because mental life is divided between awareness and hidden processes. C. Cardinal and secondary, because traits vary in their breadth and influence. D. Trust and mistrust, because development hinges on early caregiver responsiveness. Pick one. Trust your gut. Here's your chance to test yourself. The correct answer is A. Nomothetic and idiographic, because the first seeks general laws and the second studies the individual case. A is correct because Allport drew the distinction between nomothetic approaches, which look for general laws across people, and idiographic approaches, which focus on the patterns within a single individual. He argued that both have a place in personality science, but he was unusual in defending serious attention to the individual case. B is wrong because conscious and unconscious is a Freudian topographic distinction about levels of mental life, not a pair of approaches to studying personality. C is wrong because cardinal and secondary are 2 of Allport's trait categories, not a pair of methodological approaches. D is wrong because trust and mistrust is the first crisis in Erikson's developmental sequence, unrelated to research approaches in personality. Personality psychology uses 2 complementary approaches to understand who we are. The nomothetic approach seeks general laws that apply across people, while the idiographic approach studies the unique patterns of a single individual in depth. Gordon Allport borrowed these terms from the German philosopher Wilhelm Windelband and brought them into personality psychology. His key argument was not that one approach beats the other. He believed personality science genuinely requires both. Nomothetic research uses large samples and standardized measures. The 5-factor model is a nomothetic achievement. Idiographic research digs into one person's life history and personal documents. Allport's own analysis of one woman's letters over decades, called Letters from Jenny, is a classic idiographic study. When a description contrasts seeking general laws with studying one individual, nomothetic and idiographic is the right concept. Watch out for two common mix-ups. Conscious and unconscious belong to Freud's map of mental life, and cardinal versus secondary refers to Allport's trait categories. Neither is a methodological distinction. Question 30. A research review distinguishes between the broad clusters that observers can see at the surface and the deeper underlying dimensions that emerge only when many measures are statistically combined. Cattell named the deeper dimensions. Which term did he use? Your options are A. Surface traits because they describe the easily observed clusters. B. Cardinal traits because they organize the whole personality. C. Source traits because they are the underlying dimensions revealed by factor analysis. D. Central traits because they capture the handful of broad descriptors of a person. Which would you go with? Lock it in before the reveal. The correct answer is C. Source traits, because they are the underlying dimensions revealed by factor analysis. C is correct because Cattell used source traits to name the deep, underlying dimensions of personality identified through factor analysis, in contrast to surface traits, which are the visible behavioral clusters. The reviewer is asking for the deeper level concept. A is wrong because surface traits are the observable clusters, the very thing the reviewer is contrasting with the deeper dimensions. They are not what Cattell labeled the deep level. B is wrong because cardinal traits belong to Allport, not Cattell, and describe a single dominating disposition. They are not Cattell's term for the deep factor analytic dimensions. D is wrong because central traits also belong to Allport. They describe the broad descriptors that capture a person's general personality, not Cattell's underlying factors. Cattell's personality theory operates on two distinct levels: the surface, where behavior is directly observable, and a deeper structural layer that can only be reached through statistical analysis. Surface traits are the visible behavioral clusters anyone can observe and name. Things like being outgoing, talkative, or energetic. Source traits are the deeper dimensions beneath them that explain why those surface descriptors tend to travel together. Factor analysis works by collecting ratings on many surface descriptors and identifying which ones load onto the same statistical factor. Descriptors that cluster together are interpreted as reflecting one common source trait, a deeper dimension not directly observable, but inferred from the pattern. The most common confusion is blending source traits with surface traits, or importing Allport's cardinal trait concept into Cattell's framework. Source traits are uniquely Cattell and uniquely statistical. They are never directly seen, only inferred. Whenever a scenario emphasizes deep underlying dimensions revealed by factor analysis, source trait is the right answer. Attach the theorist to the term and the level of analysis to the concept, and the distinction becomes straightforward. Question 31. A co-worker plans projects carefully, keeps a tidy desk, meets every deadline, and double-checks her work before sending it. A psychology instructor evaluates her on the 5-factor model. Which factor most clearly captures this pattern of behavior? Your options are A. Openness because it reflects creativity and interest in novel experience. B. Conscientiousness because it reflects organization, reliability, and self-discipline. C. Agreeableness because it reflects cooperation and warmth. D. Neuroticism because it reflects negative emotionality and stress reactivity. Don't overthink it. Which one feels right? The correct answer is B. Conscientiousness because it reflects organization, reliability, and self-discipline. B is correct because conscientiousness in the 5-factor model captures the disposition toward organization, dependability, planning, and self-discipline. The co-worker's careful planning, tidy workspace, and reliable deadline keeping are textbook indicators of high conscientiousness. A is wrong because openness describes intellectual curiosity, imagination, and willingness to try new things. It does not directly capture the orderly, dependable pattern described. C is wrong because agreeableness describes warmth, cooperation, and concern for others. The scenario does not focus on her relationships with people, but on her work habits. D is wrong because neuroticism describes a tendency toward anxiety, worry, and negative mood. While careful workers can be anxious, the scenario describes competence and reliability rather than negative emotionality. Conscientiousness is one of the 5 broad personality dimensions in the 5-factor model, and it captures a specific cluster of traits centered on organization, planning, and self-discipline. Understanding what makes it distinct helps us avoid confusing it with related but separate ideas like intelligence or motivation. People high in conscientiousness share a recognizable pattern. They keep orderly environments, honor commitments, and prioritize long-term goals over immediate impulses. People low in conscientiousness tend to be more spontaneous and flexible, though less predictably reliable. Conscientiousness sits alongside 4 other broad dimensions in the 5-factor model, remembered by the acronym OCHAN. Each dimension captures a distinct cluster. Openness is about curiosity, agreeableness about warmth, extroversion about sociability, and neuroticism about emotional reactivity. Conscientiousness is uniquely about orderly, disciplined, dependable behavior. Conscientiousness is one of the strongest predictors of real-world outcomes in all of personality psychology. High conscientiousness forecasts better academic results, stronger job performance, and even longer life, likely because disciplined, planful behavior compounds across years and contexts. When a scenario describes someone who keeps tidy workspaces, meets every deadline, and follows through on commitments, that pattern points to conscientiousness, not intelligence, not motivation, and not any other ocean dimension. The signal words are organized, reliable, and planful. Question 32. A college student worries constantly about exams, ruminates over minor setbacks, and feels anxious when small things go wrong. An instructor describes this pattern using one of the 5-factor dimensions. Which factor fits best? Your options are A. Conscientiousness because it reflects discipline and reliability. B. Extroversion because it reflects sociability and positive emotionality. C. Agreeableness because it reflects warmth and cooperation. D. Neuroticism because it reflects a tendency toward anxiety, worry, and negative emotion. Got a guess? Lock it in. The correct answer is D. Neuroticism because it reflects a tendency toward anxiety, worry, and negative emotion. D is correct because neuroticism in the 5-factor model captures a stable tendency toward anxiety, worry, mood instability, and stress reactivity. The student's chronic worry over exams and rumination over small setbacks is a clear marker of high neuroticism. A is wrong because conscientiousness centers on discipline and orderliness. A high conscientiousness student might also worry, but worry itself is the marker for neuroticism, not conscientiousness. B is wrong because extroversion centers on sociability, energy, and positive emotion. The pattern described is the opposite of the upbeat, positive emotionality associated with extroversion. C is wrong because agreeableness centers on warmth and cooperation with others. The scenario does not describe interpersonal warmth or its absence. Neuroticism is one of the 5 broad personality dimensions in the 5-factor model. It captures a stable tendency toward negative emotionality, worry, and heightened stress reactivity, and it sits on a continuum that every person falls somewhere along. People high in neuroticism experience more intense anxiety, sadness, and irritability and they ruminate over minor setbacks. People low in neuroticism tend to be emotionally steadier and less reactive. Not necessarily happier, just less easily destabilized. Within the 5-factor model, neuroticism sits alongside openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, and agreeableness. It was retained largely intact from Eysenck's earlier Penn model, and it consistently emerges across cultures and measurement traditions as one of the most replicable personality dimensions, with meaningful heritability and strong links to mental health outcomes. The critical distinction is this: high neuroticism raises the risk for anxiety and depressive disorders, but it is not a disorder itself. Many high scorers never develop clinical pathology. Neuroticism describes the texture of someone's emotional experience, a trait, not a diagnosis. When a scenario describes a stable pattern of anxiety, worry, and emotional reactivity to ordinary stressors, neuroticism is the right dimension to name. If the description emphasizes social warmth, think agreeableness. If it emphasizes intellectual curiosity, think openness. Neuroticism is uniquely about inner emotional weather, not sociability, not warmth. Question 33. A researcher reviews a personality model that organizes individual differences along 3 superordinate dimensions: psychoticism, extroversion, and neuroticism. The reviewer credits the originator and notes the inventory developed to measure them. Which theorist developed this Penn model? Your options are A. Hans Eysenck, who proposed the 3-factor Penn model and the Eysenck personality inventory. B. Gordon Allport, who proposed cardinal, central, and secondary traits. C. Walter Mischel, who proposed the cognitive affective personality system. D. Albert Bandura, who proposed reciprocal determinism and self-efficacy. Which one is it? Pause the video if you need more time. The correct answer is A. Hans Eysenck, who proposed the 3-factor Penn model and the Eysenck personality inventory. A is correct because Eysenck developed a 3-factor model of personality known by the acronym PEN, standing for psychoticism, extroversion, and neuroticism, and built the Eysenck personality inventory to measure these dimensions. The reviewer is describing his framework directly. B is wrong because Allport's framework is built around cardinal, central, and secondary traits and an idiographic emphasis. He did not propose the Penn model. C is wrong because Mischel built the cognitive affective personality system, which describes situation-specific responses, not 3 superordinate trait dimensions. D is wrong because Bandura's social cognitive theory centers on reciprocal determinism and self-efficacy, not on a 3-factor trait model. Hans Eysenck proposed one of the most influential trait models in psychology, built around 3 superordinate dimensions captured by the acronym PEN: psychoticism, extroversion, and neuroticism. Eysenck used factor analysis on large datasets to identify these 3 dimensions, believing they were the broadest and most biologically rooted aspects of personality. He then built the Eysenck personality inventory to measure them reliably. Eysenck grounded extroversion in cortical arousal. Geen geen vorm iets uit. Introverts run hotter neurologically and avoid extra stimulation, while extroverts run cooler and seek it. Neuroticism, meanwhile, was tied to how reactive and unstable the autonomic nervous system tends to be. The 5-factor model absorbed extroversion and neuroticism from Eysenck, but replaced psychoticism with 3 dimensions: openness, conscientiousness, and agreeableness. The key signal for Eysenck is always 3 superordinate factors and the PEN acronym, not Ocean or the Big Five. When a scenario describes a 3-factor superordinate trait model with biological underpinnings, that's Eysenck. Allport focuses on cardinal and central traits, and Mischel built the situation-based CAPS model. Both are distinct from the Penn framework. Question 34. A pediatric psychologist observes that some newborns are calm and easily soothed while others are reactive and easily distressed, and that these tendencies appear within the first weeks of life. The psychologist describes this constitutional starting point in a specific way. Which concept fits? Your options are A. Reciprocal determinism because behavior, environment, and cognition interact. B. Self-actualization because the inner drive moves toward growth. C. Temperament because biologically based individual differences appear from very early life. D. Sublimation because impulses are channeled into socially valued expression. Take a second. Which answer would you pick? The correct answer is C. Temperament because biologically based individual differences appear from very early life. C is correct because temperament refers to biologically based individual differences in emotional, reactivity, and self-regulation that appear very early in life and provide a foundation for later personality. The newborn level differences the psychologist observes fit this definition. A is wrong because reciprocal determinism is Bandura's concept describing the mutual influence of behavior, person, and environment. It is not a description of constitutional newborn differences. B is wrong because self-actualization is a humanistic concept about moving toward one's potential. It does not describe early reactivity differences in infants. D is wrong because sublimation is a Freudian defense mechanism. It is unrelated to constitutional infant differences in reactivity. Temperament is the biologically based foundation that shapes how we respond to the world from the very first weeks of life. It is not the same as personality. It is the constitutional starting point from which personality later grows. Temperament shows up in two core dimensions: how intensely a baby reacts to the world, and how well they can regulate that reaction. Crucially, these differences appear before extended caregiving could explain them. Think of temperament as the seed and personality as the fully grown plant. The seed's nature matters enormously, but so does the soil, the climate, and the care it receives. A highly reactive infant raised in a calm environment can develop very differently from one raised in a chaotic one. Thomas and Chess's landmark New York longitudinal study identified multiple temperamental traits. Later researchers consolidated these into three broad categories: emotional reactivity, effortful control, and surgency, each with roots in the arousal systems and limbic structures of the brain. When a question describes early appearing, biologically based differences in reactivity or emotional style, temperament is your answer. Adult personality reflects temperament plus experience, the finished product, not the raw material. Question 35. A coach describes one team member as imaginative, drawn to new ideas, and eager to try unfamiliar training methods. A sports psychologist evaluates this pattern using the 5-factor model. Which factor best captures it? Your options are A. Conscientiousness because it reflects discipline and dependability. B. Openness because it reflects curiosity, imagination, and willingness to try new experiences. C. Agreeableness because it reflects warmth and cooperation. D. Neuroticism because it reflects a tendency toward anxiety and negative mood. Before I reveal it, which one do you think is right? The correct answer is B. Openness because it reflects curiosity, imagination, and willingness to try new experiences. B is correct because openness to experience in the 5-factor model captures imagination, intellectual curiosity, and a willingness to engage with novel ideas and methods. The athlete's eagerness to try unfamiliar training and openness to new ideas is a clear marker of high openness. Is wrong because conscientiousness centers on discipline, organization, and dependability. It does not capture the imagination and openness to novelty described. C is wrong because agreeableness centers on warmth and cooperation with others. The scenario does not describe interpersonal warmth. D is wrong because neuroticism centers on negative emotionality and stress reactivity. The athlete in the scenario shows curiosity, the opposite of anxious withdrawal. Openness to experience is one of the 5 broad dimensions of the 5-factor model. It captures the disposition to seek out, engage with, and enjoy novel ideas, methods, and experiences, not just the capacity to understand them. People high in openness are drawn to variety, unconventional perspectives, and intellectual exploration. People low in openness gravitate toward the familiar and the concrete. Both ends are normal. This is a dimension, not a flaw. A critical distinction: openness and intelligence are correlated but separate constructs. Intelligence describes what you can do cognitively. Openness describes what you are drawn to do. Whether you seek out novelty, complexity, and imagination in the first place. A brilliant person can be low in openness, and average intellect can be high. The 2 most common mix-ups are conscientiousness and neuroticism. Conscientiousness is about organization and self-discipline, not curiosity. Neuroticism is about anxiety and stress reactivity, also unrelated to openness. The cleanest signal for openness is curiosity and willingness to try unfamiliar approaches. Whenever a scenario highlights imagination, intellectual curiosity, aesthetic sensitivity, or eagerness to try new experiences, that pattern points to openness. The 5-factor dimension most clearly linked to creativity and a love of ideas. Question 36. A psychology instructor describes a researcher who explained personality through reinforcement, schedules of reward, and shaping behavior through environmental contingencies, with little reference to inner mental states. Which figure most clearly fits this description? Your options are A. Carl Rogers, who built person-centered therapy on unconditional positive regard. B. Carl Jung, who built analytical psychology on the collective unconscious. C. Sigmund Freud, who built psychoanalysis on unconscious conflict. D. B. Skinner, who built operant behaviorism on reinforcement and shaping. What's your answer? Commit to one before I continue. The correct answer is D. B. F. Skinner, who built operant behaviorism on reinforcement and shaping. D is correct because Skinner built operant behaviorism around how reinforcement and punishment shape behavior over time, focusing on observable contingencies rather than inner mental states. His treatment of personality as a learned pattern of responses fits the description directly. A is wrong because Rogers worked from a humanistic standpoint focused on the self and the conditions for growth, especially unconditional positive regard. He is the opposite of a strict reinforcement-focused theorist. B is wrong because Jung worked from a depth psychology standpoint, focusing on the collective unconscious and archetypes. He centered inner mental life rather than reinforcement. C is wrong because Freud focused on unconscious conflict, drives, and defense mechanisms. He did not explain personality through environmental reinforcement schedules. B. F. Skinner built the most complete behaviorist account of personality in 20th century psychology. His core claim is that what we call personality is really a learned pattern of responses, shaped entirely by environmental consequences. The engine of Skinner's framework is operant conditioning. Behavior followed by favorable outcomes becomes more frequent, while behavior followed by unfavorable outcomes fades. Critically, the schedule on which reinforcement is delivered, continuous versus variable, powerfully determines how persistent that behavior becomes. Continuous reinforcement produces quick learning, but the behavior collapses fast once rewards stop. Variable ratio schedules, like a slot machine paying out unpredictably, produce behavior that is remarkably persistent and difficult to extinguish. This is why Skinner could explain everything from animal training to human habit formation with the same principles. Skinner stands in sharp contrast to the other major theorists. Rogers focused on inner growth and unconditional positive regard. Jung centered the collective unconscious and archetypes. Skinner alone built his entire account of personality around observable behavior and environmental contingencies, deliberately rejecting inner mental causes. Whenever a scenario describes personality as a learned pattern shaped by reinforcement schedules and observable contingencies, with little appeal to inner mental states, that is Skinner. Note that he never denied thoughts or feelings exist. He simply argued they are products of the same environmental forces that produce behavior. Question 37. A behavioral psychologist describes how a child's repeated patterns, such as biting nails when anxious or saying please when needing something, become automatic responses through countless small interactions with the environment. Arthur Startz described this aspect of personality in a particular way. Which concept fits? Your options are A. Habit formation because behavior crystallizes through repeated environment behavior interactions. B. Repression because anxiety-provoking material is forced out of conscious awareness. C. Synchronicity because meaningful coincidences signal deeper connection. D. Anima because the inner feminine image surfaces in projection. Pick one. Trust your gut. Here's your chance to test yourself. The correct answer is A. Habit formation because behavior crystallizes through repeated environment behavior interactions. A is correct because Startz emphasized habit formation as a central process in personality, arguing that personality crystallizes through countless small behavior environment interactions that produce stable habits. The repeated automatic behaviors described are precisely what he meant. B is wrong because repression is a Freudian defense mechanism, not a behaviorist concept. It addresses the burial of anxious material, not the formation of habits. C is wrong because synchronicity is Jung's concept of meaningful coincidence. It is unrelated to learned automatic behavior. D is wrong because the anima is a Jungian archetype. It does not describe the behaviorist process of habit formation. Habit formation is far more than brushing teeth or morning routines. In Arthur Startz's psychological behaviorism, it is the core mechanism through which personality itself is built. A behavior occurs in a stable context and produces a reinforcing consequence. With enough repetition, the behavior stops requiring deliberate decision and is instead triggered automatically by those contextual cues. Startz saw personality as a richly layered structure, simple motor habits at the foundation, with emotional, cognitive, and language habits accumulating on top through thousands of small behavior-environment interactions over development. All four habit types, motor, emotional, cognitive, and language, share the same developmental mechanism. Together they constitute what other theorists call personality, making habit formation uniquely broad in Startz's psychological behaviorism. When a scenario describes behavior becoming automatic through repeated environment interactions, that is habit formation, not repression, not archetypes, but behaviorist patterns built up across developmental time. Question 38. A graduate seminar contrasts two traditions in personality theory. One looks inward at unconscious conflicts and inner drives, while the other focuses on observable behavior shaped by environmental contingencies. Which pair of traditions does this contrast match? Your options are A. Trait theory and biological theory, because both focus on stable structures. B. Humanistic theory and behaviorism, because both focus on subjective experience. C. Psychodynamic theory and behaviorism, because the first looks inward and the second looks at observable, learned responses. D. Cognitive theory and humanistic theory, because both focus on internal mental processes. Which would you go with? Lock it in before the reveal. The correct answer is C. Psychodynamic theory and behaviorism, because the first looks inward and the second looks at observable, learned responses. C is correct because psychodynamic theory looks inward at unconscious conflict and drives, while behaviorism focuses on observable behavior shaped by reinforcement and conditioning. The contrast in the seminar maps directly onto these two traditions. A is wrong because trait and biological theories share an interest in stable structures and heritable dispositions. They are not the inward versus outward contrast described. B is wrong because humanistic theory focuses on subjective experience and growth, while behaviorism explicitly avoids subjective experience. These two are not aligned in focus. D is wrong because cognitive and humanistic theories both attend to internal experience, but neither matches the behaviorist outward focus described. Two of the most influential traditions in personality psychology are psychodynamic theory and behaviorism, and they couldn't be more different in how they explain human behavior. Psychodynamic theory looks inward, at unconscious drives, hidden conflicts, and defense mechanisms shaped by early experience. Behaviorism looks outward, at observable behavior and the environmental contingencies that reinforce or suppress it. Freud, Jung, and Adler built the psychodynamic tradition using clinical methods like free association and dream interpretation. Watson and Skinner built behaviorism on rigorous observation and conditioning experiments, explicitly rejecting talk of the unconscious as unscientific speculation. When a question describes a framework focused on hidden inner forces, think psychodynamic. When it describes behavior shaped by external reinforcement and contingencies, think behaviorism. These signal words reliably distinguish the two. Modern approaches often blend both traditions, but historically the opposition is sharp. Knowing which questions each tradition asks and which methods it uses is the key to telling them apart. Question 39. A researcher studying anxiety reduction proposes that learning depends on a chain of drive. Q. Response and reinforcement, and explains complex behaviors such as language and habit through this sequence. Which theorists are most clearly associated with the stimulus-response account of personality and learning? Your options are A. Maslow and Rogers, the central figures of the humanistic perspective. B. Dollard and Miller, who translated psychoanalytic ideas into stimulus-response learning. C. Jung and Adler, the early figures who broke from Freudian orthodoxy. D. Allport and Cattell, the foundational trait theorists. Don't overthink it. Which one feels right? The correct answer is B. Dollard and Miller, who translated psychoanalytic ideas into stimulus-response learning. B is correct because Dollard and Miller built a stimulus-response account of personality and learning, organizing behavior around drive. Q. Response and reinforcement, and using this framework to translate psychoanalytic ideas into learning theory terms. The researcher's framework matches their approach directly. A is wrong because Maslow and Rogers were humanistic theorists focused on growth and self-actualization. They did not work in the stimulus-response tradition. C is wrong because Jung and Adler broke from Freud but stayed within depth psychology rather than moving into behaviorist learning theory. D is wrong because Allport and Cattell were trait theorists, focused on dispositional structure rather than on learning processes. Dollard and Miller built a bridge between two dominant traditions in American psychology, behaviorist learning theory and psychoanalysis, by reframing clinical phenomena in stimulus-response terms. Working at Yale in the 1930s and 40s, they argued that Freudian concepts like repression, conflict, and neurosis didn't need to be abandoned. They could be recast in the language of learning theory without losing their clinical power. Their framework organizes all behavior around 4 concepts. A drive provides the energy to act. A cue signals which response is appropriate. The organism responds, and if that response reduces the drive, it is reinforced, making it more likely to occur again. The key confusables are Maslow and Rogers, who focused on humanistic growth and self-actualization, and Jung and Adler, who stayed within depth psychology. Only Dollard and Miller built a stimulus-response account of personality that systematically translated psychoanalytic ideas into learning theory. Whenever a scenario describes personality and neurosis explained through drive, response, and reinforcement, and frames it as a translation between psychoanalysis and learning theory, Dollard and Miller are the theorists being asked about. Question 40. A psychologist reviewing the work of Dollard and Miller emphasizes that their model treats motivation as the engine that triggers behavior, with behavior eventually being maintained by what reduces it. Which concept names the central motivational mechanism in their account? Your options are A. Self-actualization, because the inner drive pushes toward potential. B. Reciprocal determinism, because behavior, person, and environment interact. C. Transference, because feelings about earlier figures are projected onto the therapist. D. Drive reduction, because behavior is reinforced by what lowers a driving state. Got a guess? Lock it in. The correct answer is D. Drive reduction, because behavior is reinforced by what lowers a driving state. D is correct because Dollard and Miller built their account of learning and personality around drive reduction, the idea that behavior is reinforced by what lowers an arousing drive state. The reviewer is naming the central motivational mechanism. A is wrong because self-actualization is a humanistic concept, central to Maslow and Rogers, not to Dollard and Miller's stimulus-response account. B is wrong because reciprocal determinism is Bandura's social cognitive concept describing mutual influence among behavior, person, and environment. It is a different framework. C is wrong because transference is a psychoanalytic clinical concept. It is unrelated to drive reduction as a learning mechanism. Drive reduction is the core motivational mechanism in Dollard and Miller's theory of learning and personality. The central idea is simple. Behavior is reinforced by whatever lowers an aroused drive state. The sequence works in 3 steps. A drive state arises, or like hunger or anxiety. The organism behaves. If that behavior lowers the drive, the reduction itself is the reinforcement, making that behavior more likely next time. Dollard and Miller distinguish primary drives, like hunger and pain, from learner drives like anxiety. Anxiety is especially powerful because it can attach to almost any cue and then drive avoidance behavior broadly, which is how neurotic patterns become entrenched. Consider someone who avoids public speaking. Each avoidance drops her anxiety sharply. That drop reinforces the avoidance, making it more likely next time. Over months, the avoidance becomes deeply entrenched. A classic Dollard and Miller drive reduction loop in clinical action. Drive reduction is not just any motivation. It is specifically the claim that reinforcement comes from lowering arousal, the mechanism Dollard and Miller used to bridge behaviorism and psychoanalysis, and the framework that explains how habits and neurotic patterns develop over time. Question 41. A preschool teacher notices that after one child sees another child solve a puzzle in a particular way, several other children attempt the same approach without any direct instruction or reward. A social cognitive theorist describes this kind of learning. Which concept best fits? Your options are A. Operant conditioning, because behavior is shaped by reinforcement and punishment. B. Classical conditioning, because a neutral stimulus comes to evoke a response through pairing. C. Observational learning, because behavior is acquired by watching and modeling in others. D. Habituation, because repeated exposure reduces the strength of a response. Which one is it? Pause the video if you need more time. The correct answer is C. Observational learning, because behavior is acquired by watching and modeling others. C is correct because Bandura's social cognitive account places observational learning at the center, arguing that people acquire new behaviors by watching and imitating models without direct reinforcement. The preschooler's modeling of the puzzle solution is a textbook example. A is wrong because operant conditioning depends on direct reinforcement or punishment of the learner. The children in the scenario learn from watching, not from being rewarded for trying. B is wrong because classical conditioning involves pairing a neutral stimulus with one that already elicits a response. The scenario describes copying a behavior, not associative pairing. D is wrong because habituation refers to the decline in response after repeated exposure. The scenario describes acquisition of a new behavior, the opposite of habituation. Observational learning is how we acquire behavior by watching others. No direct reinforcement required. Albert Bandura placed this process at the heart of his social cognitive theory, arguing it explains a huge portion of how humans learn to behave socially. Bandura described 4 mechanisms that drive observational learning. First, attention determines what gets noticed in the model's behavior. Retention determines what is remembered. Reproduction is whether the learner can physically perform it, and motivation determines whether they actually choose to act. Bandura's famous Bobo doll experiments demonstrated this vividly. Children who simply watched adults act aggressively later behaved more aggressively themselves, without ever being rewarded or punished for doing so. The key distinction is what separates observational learning from operant and classical conditioning. Operant conditioning requires the learner to be directly reinforced. Classical conditioning involves pairing stimuli. Observational learning involves neither, only watching and modeling. Whenever a scenario describes behavior picked up by watching others, without any direct instruction or reward to the learner, that is observational learning. It is Bandura's core insight. Modeling is a real, distinct learning mechanism all its own. Question 42. A nursing instructor encourages a struggling student by helping her break a clinical skill into manageable steps. Master each one and reflect on her growing competence. The instructor is targeting a specific belief that Bandura placed at the center of his social cognitive theory. Which belief is the instructor building? Your options are A. Self-efficacy, because it is the belief in one's own ability to succeed at a specific task. B. Self-actualization, because it is the drive to realize one's full potential. C. Self-concept, because it is the overall picture a person holds of who they are. D. Self-regulation, because it is the capacity to monitor and adjust one's own behavior. Take a second. Which answer would you pick? The correct answer is A. Self-efficacy, because it is the belief in one's own ability to succeed at a specific task. A is correct because self-efficacy is Bandura's term for the belief in one's own ability to succeed at a specific task or class of tasks. Mastery experience is broken into manageable steps or one of the strongest sources of self-efficacy, exactly the strategy the instructor is using. B is wrong because self-actualization is a humanistic concept tied to Maslow and Rogers, naming the broad drive toward fulfillment. It is not Bandura's task-specific belief. C is wrong because self-concept is the broader picture a person holds of themselves. Self-efficacy is narrower and more situation-specific. D is wrong because self-regulation is the capacity to monitor and adjust behavior, a related but distinct concept. The instructor is building belief in the ability to succeed. not the regulatory capacity itself. Self-efficacy is Albert Bandura's term for a person's belief in their own ability to succeed at a specific task. Unlike self-esteem, which is a broad evaluation of self-worth, self-efficacy is narrowly task-specific. You can have high self-efficacy for cooking and low self-efficacy for public speaking at the same time. Bandura identified 4 sources that build this belief. Mastery experiences, actually succeeding at the task, are the strongest. Seeing similar others succeed, receiving encouragement from trusted people, and interpreting one's own physical arousal as readiness rather than anxiety all contribute as well. Educators and clinicians can deliberately target each source. The most common confusion is collapsing self-efficacy with related but distinct concepts. Self-esteem is a broad judgment of worth. Self-concept is the overall picture of who one is, and self-actualization is Maslow and Rogers' drive toward fulfillment. Self-efficacy is narrower than all of these. It is specifically about believing you can succeed at a particular task. When a scenario describes building task-specific confidence through structured successes, what far like an instructor breaking a skill into steps so a student can master each one. That is self-efficacy in action. It is Bandura's uniquely powerful insight that belief in ability is itself one of the strongest predictors of actual performance. Question 43. A teacher describes a classroom in which the student's behavior, the student's beliefs, and the classroom environment all influence one another in a continuous loop. The teacher cites Bandura's account of how personality functions. Which concept names this mutual influence? Your options are A. Psychic determinism, because all behavior has unconscious causes. B. Drive reduction, because behavior is reinforced by lowering a driving state. C. Social interest, because connection to others is the marker of health. D. Reciprocal determinism, because behavior, person, and environment continuously influence each other. Before I reveal it, which one do you think is right? The correct answer is D. Reciprocal determinism, because behavior, person, and environment continuously influence each other. D is correct because Bandura's reciprocal determinism describes the continuous, mutual influence among behavior, personal factors such as cognition, and the environment. The teacher's 3-way looping description captures this concept directly. A is wrong because psychic determinism is Freud's principle that mental events have unconscious causes. It is a one-direction inward account, not a 3-way loop. B is wrong because drive reduction is a learning theory concept from Dollard and Miller. It does not name a 3-way mutual influence among person, behavior, and environment. C is wrong because social interest is Adler's marker of psychological health. It does not describe a model of how personality functions in a loop. Reciprocal determinism is Albert Bandura's core insight about how personality actually works, not as a fixed cause, but as a participant in an ongoing 3-way process of mutual shaping. Bandura identified 3 forces: the person's thoughts and emotions, their behavior, and the environment, that each continuously influence the others. No single force is the ultimate driver. The loop is genuinely 3-way. A confident student raises her hand more, gets called on more, builds skill and confidence, and changes the classroom climate around her, each element reshaping the others continuously. Bandura developed this concept as a corrective. Strict behaviorism, privileged environment. Strict trait theory, privileged personality. Reciprocal determinism rejects choosing a single driver and insists all 3 sources modify each other over time. When a scenario describes behavior, personal factors, and environment all shaping one another in an ongoing loop, with no single cause privileged, that is reciprocal determinism, one direction accounts, whether Freudian or behaviorist are something else entirely. Question 44. A research assistant studying preschoolers offers each child a single marshmallow now or 2 marshmallows after a short wait. The team uses the result to study the capacity for delayed gratification, and its later life correlates. The study tradition is associated with a specific researcher. Which researcher? Your options are A. Hans Eysenck, who developed the 3-factor PN model of personality. B. Walter Mischel, who pioneered research on delayed gratification with the marshmallow study. C. Carl Jung, who described the collective unconscious and archetypes. D. Karen Horney, who described basic anxiety and 3 interpersonal orientations. What's your answer? Commit to one before I continue. The correct answer is B. Walter Mischel, who pioneered research on delayed gratification with the marshmallow study. B is correct because Walter Mischel pioneered the marshmallow studies on preschoolers' capacity for delayed gratification and traced links between early self-control and later life outcomes. His name is the standard reference point for this paradigm. A is wrong because Eysenck developed the 3-factor pen trait model. He did not run the marshmallow studies on delayed gratification. C is wrong because Jung worked in depth psychology on the collective unconscious and archetypes. He had no role in delayed gratification research. D is wrong because Horney developed relational theory. She did not study delayed gratification in children. Walter Mischel's marshmallow studies revealed something profound about self-control. It isn't a fixed personality trait, but a skill built from specific cognitive strategies. Understanding the mechanism behind the paradigm is what makes it so influential in personality psychology. Preschoolers faced a simple but powerful choice: eat 1 marshmallow immediately, or wait a short period and receive 2. What varied dramatically across children was not just willpower, but the strategies they used to bridge that delay. Children who looked directly at the marshmallow gave in sooner. Those who looked away distracted themselves or mentally reframed the treat, imagining it as a fluffy cloud rather than food. Waited far longer. The strategy, not the willpower, was doing the work. Mischel argued that delayed gratification is a set of teachable cognitive skills, not a fixed trait stamped at birth. Later longitudinal research did find correlations between early delay capacity and life outcomes, but those links are complex and partly explained by family resources and environment. The lasting lesson of the marshmallow studies is that self-control is cognitively structured and learnable. Mischel is uniquely linked to this paradigm, distinct from Eysenck's trait model and Jung's depth psychology. Question 45. A clinician describes a person whose behavior shifts noticeably across situations because the same trigger activates very different patterns of thought and feeling depending on context. The clinician draws on a model that emphasizes situation-specific responses tied to underlying mental units. Which model fits? Your options are a hierarchy of needs model because higher needs depend on lower needs being met. B. 8 stages model because development unfolds across the lifespan. C. Cognitive affective personality system because situation-specific responses arise from underlying mental units. D. 3-factor pen model because personality reduces to 3 superordinate dimensions. Pick one. Trust your gut. Here's your chance to test yourself. The correct answer is C. Cognitive affective personality system because situation-specific responses arise from underlying mental units. C is correct because Mischel's cognitive affective personality system, often shortened to CAPS, describes how situation-specific responses arise from underlying cognitive affective units, such as expectancies, goals, and competencies that are activated differently by different situations. The clinician's emphasis on shifting responses to the same trigger across contexts fits this model. A is wrong because the hierarchy of needs is Maslow's humanistic framework, focused on universal needs from physiological to self-actualization. It does not describe situation-specific shifts. B is wrong because the 8 stages model is Erikson's developmental framework. It does not describe within-person variability across situations. D is wrong because the 3-factor pen model is Eysenck's trait framework. It treats personality as broad, stable dimensions, not as context-dependent shifts. Walter Mischel's Cognitive Affective Personality System, or CAPS, offers a sophisticated answer to an old debate: do traits or situations drive behavior? Mischel argued that question was misframed from the start. CAPS rejects both the idea that fixed traits produce uniform behavior and the idea that situations alone dictate responses. Instead, personality is a stable network of cognitive and emotional units that interact with situations. The network is built from 5 kinds of cognitive affective units: encodings, expectancies, affects, goals and values, and self-regulatory competencies. Every person has a unique, stable arrangement of these units. Different situations activate different parts of the same underlying network, which is why the same person can be assertive at work and deferential at home. The network itself stays constant. What varies is which part gets switched on. The hallmark of CAPS is the if-then pattern. Each person has a distinctive profile of situation response signatures. Consistency lives in the network, not in identical behavior across all contexts. Question 46. A counselor working from a humanistic perspective listens with full attention, communicates warm acceptance regardless of what the client shares, and refrains from judgment. The counselor is offering one of the conditions Carl Rogers placed at the center of healthy growth. Which condition is being offered? Your options are A. Unconditional positive regard, because the client receives acceptance regardless of behavior. B. Reciprocal determinism, because behavior, person, and environment shape each other. C. Drive reduction, because tension-reducing responses are reinforced. D. Cardinal trait identification, because the dominant disposition is identified. Which would you go with? Lock it in before the reveal. The correct answer is A. Unconditional positive regard, because the client receives acceptance regardless of behavior. A is correct because unconditional positive regard is Rogers' term for the warm, non-judgmental acceptance that allows a client to explore and grow. The counselor's pattern of attentive, warm, non-judgmental listening is the textbook description of providing this condition. B is wrong because reciprocal determinism is Bandura's concept about mutual influence among behavior, person, and environment. It is not a Rogers therapeutic condition. C is wrong because drive reduction belongs to Dollard and Miller's stimulus response account. It is not a humanistic therapy condition. D is wrong because cardinal trait identification belongs to Allport's trait theory. It is not part of Rogers' framework. Unconditional positive regard is Carl Rogers' term for a specific therapeutic stance. Warm, accepting attention to the whole person, offered without conditions or judgment. It's one of the foundational ideas in humanistic, person-centered therapy. Rogers identified 3 conditions necessary for therapeutic growth. Unconditional positive regard is paired with empathic understanding and congruence, where the therapist's outward responses match their inner experience. Together, these create the relational context in which the client's own growth can unfold. When these conditions are present, the client experiences the therapist as someone who values them as a person, not based on behavior or achievement, but consistently and without strings attached. That safety allows the client to explore parts of themselves they've previously kept hidden or rejected. A common misreading is that unconditional positive regard means more approval of everything the client does. Rogers was clear. The therapist values the person without conditions, but can still notice when a behavior is harmful. The unconditional element is about the steadiness of acceptance for the person, not a refusal to engage with consequences. Rogers believed that when a person genuinely experiences being valued without conditions, they become able to risk knowing themselves more fully, integrating rejected experience and moving toward who they most want to become. Question 47. A graduate student studying motivation reads about a model in which basic physiological needs sit at the foundation. Safety needs come next, then love and belonging, then esteem, with self-actualization at the top. Which theorist's model is being described? Your options are A. Sigmund Freud, who described 5 psychosexual stages. B. Erikson, who described 8 psychosocial stages. C. Karen Horney, who described 3 interpersonal orientations. D. Abraham Maslow, who described the hierarchy of needs culminating in self-actualization. Don't overthink it. Which one feels right? The correct answer is D. Abraham Maslow, who described the hierarchy of needs culminating in self-actualization. D is correct because Maslow's hierarchy of needs is the model the student is reading, with physiological needs at the base, then safety, love and belonging, esteem, and self-actualization at the top. The structure described matches his framework exactly. A is wrong because Freud described psychosexual stages of childhood development, not a hierarchy of needs leading to self-actualization. B is wrong because Erikson describes psychosocial crises across the lifespan, not a hierarchical needs model. C is wrong because Horney described interpersonal orientations in response to basic anxiety, not a needs hierarchy. Maslow's hierarchy of needs is a foundational model explaining how human motivation is organized across 5 levels, from basic survival all the way to personal fulfillment. Maslow developed it in the 1940s as a reaction to psychoanalysis and behaviorism, which he felt ignored the full range of healthy human striving. As lower needs are reasonably satisfied, higher needs become more salient and begin to organize behavior. A person focused on finding food cannot attend to relationships. But once physiological and safety needs are met, belonging and esteem naturally come into focus. This mechanism is called hierarchical activation. Maslow was clear that it describes a general pattern, not a strict lockstep sequence. People often pursue higher needs while lower ones are only partly satisfied, and the relative weights shift across cultures and life stages. The key to distinguishing Maslow from similar theorists is focus. Freud describes childhood psychosexual stages, Erikson describes lifespan psychosocial crises, and Horney describes interpersonal orientations. Only Maslow organizes motivation as a 5-level needs hierarchy spanning basic survival through self-actualization. The hierarchy is best understood as a useful organizing model, not a strict rule. When a scenario involves 5 motivational levels from survival to personal potential, Maslow is your theorist. Question 48. A college student says she feels exhausted because the person she presents to friends and professors does not match the person she feels she truly is, producing constant tension. A Rogers-informed counselor describes this gap in a specific way. Which concept best fits? Your options are A. Cognitive affective unit mismatch because situational triggers fire inconsistently. B. Incongruence between the real self and the ideal self, because the gap between actual experience and the desired self-image creates distress. C. Inferiority complex, because the person feels worthless and ceases striving. D. Reaction formation, because impulses are converted into their opposites. Got a guess? Lock it in. The correct answer is B. Incongruence between the real self and the ideal self, because the gap between actual experience and the desired self-image creates distress. B is correct because Rogers described incongruence as the gap between the real self, the person as she actually experiences herself, and the ideal self, the person she believes she ought to be. The student's exhaustion from this mismatch is a textbook description of incongruence. A is wrong because cognitive affective units come from Mischel's CAPS model and describe situation-specific cognitive emotional responses. They do not name the real self versus ideal self gap. C is wrong because an inferiority complex is Adler's term for a stalled striving driven by overwhelming feelings of worthlessness. It is not Rogers' real versus ideal mismatch. D is wrong because reaction formation is a Freudian defense mechanism. It does not describe the discrepancy between actual and ideal self. Carl Rogers identified two aspects of self-experience that sit at the heart of his theory of psychological health and distress. Understanding how they relate explains much of what Rogers saw in his clinical work. The real self captures your actual feelings, values, and capacities as you live them. The ideal self is often assembled from conditions others placed on your acceptance, what you had to be to receive love. When these two selves align, Rogers called that congruence. When they diverge, incongruence emerges as inattention and distress. Healthy development depends on what Rogers called the actualizing tendency, an innate drive toward growth, being supported by unconditional positive regard. When caregivers attach love to conditions, the child builds an ideal self around those conditions, suppressing real experiences that conflict with the demanded image. The gap between the circles widens across development. The mechanism unfolds step by step. A child learns acceptance depends on matching an external standard and begins pushing conflicting experiences out of awareness. Those experiences don't disappear. They remain part of the real self, pressing for acknowledgement. Adult exhaustion and inauthenticity often trace directly back to this early suppression. Rogers was clear. The ideal self isn't the problem when it grows from your own actualizing direction. The problem arises when it is built entirely from others' conditions of worth. Person-centered therapy creates the relational space where suppressed real self material can finally be integrated. Question 49. A client at the top of a successful career describes a quiet sense of meaning, frequent moments of deep fulfillment, and an interest in causes larger than himself. A humanistic therapist describes this as the upper region of Maslow's hierarchy and notes the specific level the client is engaging, which need most clearly fits. Your options are A. Safety needs because the person seeks predictability and security. B. Physiological needs because the body's basic survival requirements come first. C. Self-actualization because the person is fulfilling potential and seeking deep meaning. D. Love and belonging needs because the person seeks connection and intimacy. Which one is it? Pause the video if you need more time. The correct answer is C. Self-actualization because the person is fulfilling potential and seeking deep meaning. C is correct because self-actualization sits at the top of Maslow's hierarchy and describes the realization of personal potential, often accompanied by peak experiences of deep meaning and engagement with causes larger than the self. The client's pattern fits this level directly. A is wrong because safety needs are at the second tier and concern security and predictability. The client described is operating well above this level. B is wrong because physiological needs are the bottom tier of survival requirements like food and sleep. The client is far above this level. D is wrong because love and belonging needs are the third tier and concern intimate connection and group acceptance. The client is engaging with broader meaning, not basic relational needs. Self-actualization sits at the very top of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It refers to the ongoing process of realizing your full potential, not a destination you reach. but a continuous engagement with becoming who you are capable of being. Lower needs: survival, safety, belonging, and esteem must be reasonably satisfied before the energy for self-actualization becomes available. As long as a person is preoccupied with hunger, danger, or the need for recognition, that actualizing energy is largely consumed elsewhere. Maslow describes self-actualizing people through a cluster of shared characteristics. They tend to perceive reality clearly, accept themselves and others, focus on problems beyond themselves, and maintain a strong inner ethical compass. This list is descriptive. No real person fits it perfectly. When lower needs stop dominating attention, the energy for deeper growth is finally released. Self-actualization isn't about constant happiness. It often involves struggle and discomfort. But it is about fully engaging with the work of becoming yourself. The signal to recognize self-actualization is a person fulfilling their capacities, seeking deep meaning, and engaging with causes larger than themselves. It is uniquely about personal realization at the highest level of motivation. Question 50. A researcher describes a movement in psychology that shifted attention from what makes people sick to what makes them flourish, studying topics like character strengths, gratitude, and meaning. A textbook traces the movement back to leaders such as Martin Seligman and earlier humanistic figures. Which movement is being described? Your options are A. Positive psychology, because it studies the conditions and qualities that allow people to flourish. B. Behaviorism, because it studies observable responses shaped by reinforcement. C. Psychoanalysis, because it studies unconscious conflict and defense mechanisms. D. Trait psychology, because it studies stable individual differences. Take a second. Which answer would you pick? The correct answer is A. Positive psychology, because it studies the conditions and qualities that allow people to flourish. A is correct because positive psychology is the movement that explicitly shifted attention from pathology toward flourishing, character strengths, gratitude, meaning, and well-being. Its lineage runs through humanistic figures like Maslow and Rogers and was organized into a formal movement by Martin Seligman. B is wrong because behaviorism focuses on observable responses shaped by reinforcement and is largely silent on inner flourishing or meaning. C is wrong because psychoanalysis centers on unconscious conflict and defense, the very pathology focus that positive psychology was reacting against. D is wrong because trait psychology studies stable individual differences, but does not focus on flourishing or character strengths as its central project. Positive psychology is a modern movement that shifted the field's focus from what makes people sick to what allows them to flourish. Organized formally in the late 1990s by Martin Seligman, it argued that psychology had grown too focused on pathology and had lost sight of the broader human potential for well-being and meaning. Seligman and colleagues didn't abandon rigor. They applied the same empirical methods psychology uses to study disorder, to study the conditions that allow people to live genuinely good lives. The movement has deep roots in humanistic psychology. Maslow and Rogers had long argued that psychology should attend to growth and self-realization. Seligman revived that concern and married it to rigorous methods, large-scale surveys, intervention studies, and longitudinal research. Research has identified character strengths that appear consistently across cultures and distinguish two forms of well-being: hedonic, focused on pleasure, and eudaimonic, focused on meaning, a distinction tracing back to Aristotle. Crucially, positive psychology is empirical, not motivational. It studies flourishing with the same rigor the field brings to disorder.
You have reached the end of our first question set. For the free complete exam preparation, visit our website link in the description where you find thousands more practice questions and comprehensive study guides. Thanks for studying with us today. See you in the next video.